The sudden death bore down on him in a way he never saw coming, like it was taunting him with the idea that resurrection even existed. Once again, Alma's got thrown into a brand new world, maybe the afterlife. But there was zero Sansu River and none of that familiar flower garden magic anyone ever mentions. At first, he was hit with a brutal hunger and even eyed the leaves nearby like they were his only hope. Then he forced himself to hunt. He's grinning with a freshly caught fish in one hand and a freaky-looking bug in the other. Almas was sure he'd already died, and honestly, maybe it felt like a miracle just to finally fill his stomach for the first time in his life. Almas choked on a meal that was still alive, and the sheer horror hit so hard that it lingered even worse afterward. Almas stared in pure confusion, because just days ago he'd already died in a car crash by the river. River froze, staring into the water like it was staring back, terror gripping him. While Almas refused to recognize the face, he couldn't stop asking himself, am I already dead? Or Almas couldn't shake the idea that maybe he'd been reincarnated. Or even worse, his soul had been ripped into a new body. So he told him. Next morning, the second Almas woke up, he bolted to the stream to stare at his reflection, because he had to face the terrifying truth that he was really trapped in a whole new body. Almas shot a hopeful look and immediately started laying down the essentials to survive this brutal forest. A griffin swooped into view, chirping softly as it shot out of its territory in a blink. It caught its own reflection, and fear hit like a punch, while the griffin mocked it with a sneer. It bragged about having strict diet standards, then acted like there was no way it was even going to touch that dreadful griffin meat. It reeled at the thought of getting dumped into this wild new world on an empty stomach. It hurried up and bowed to the griffin, begging forgiveness for barging into its territory. They sat there and talked about the griffin-human contract like it was common knowledge. So common, even the kids already knew it. It demanded the griffin's approval, claiming it could spare the creature as long as the story checked out. And even if the griffin wouldn't buy it, it still had to cling to its own survival. So Almas finally came clean. Admitted it slipped into a sorry apology, then kept urging Almas to claw its way into this new world and even grow to hate its old one. And if Almas was praying for anything better after that talk, that hope was crushed. The griffin did agree to. The griffin dragged Almas straight into a huge cave packed with its griffin kids, and every single one stared. They demanded answers, and the griffin snapped that they were its kin. Then it went on about how, for some reason nobody could explain. He asked the griffin whether his job was to look after these kids. Almas spotted a tiny pile of fruits tucked inside the cave, and immediately knew Griffin must have left. Almas nodded, understanding hit, and he promised from that moment on he'd take care of the kids. He spun around to the kids and declared, "From this day on, I'm your leader." The kids answered back, but Almas couldn't catch a single word of their language. Griffin quickly apologized and told him, "You can't." Griffin could still help Almas talk thanks to his divine blessing, and he even offered to share. Suddenly, everything clicked in the most miraculous way. When Ron, a boy, stepped forward and declared himself the new leader, Almas clocked a cluster of homeless kids and thought, "They look happy." But the moment he looked closer, he knew. He promised he'd protect them, then his mind drifted to starting a farm, because in this, Griffin said he'd only back them for 3 years, and with 31 kids and Almas in the mix, they'd have to become self-sufficient, especially deep in a tangled forest, where the trees closed in around him. Turns out the biggest problem could be crushed, because they were all just kids with barely any skill with tools. So Rose, the feudal Graham snapped back, saying they had no other plan, brushed aside the kid's idea. He stepped up and demanded to know if Almas planned to use those. Tetra nodded, then snapped into a full explanation of where they were. Romelia Forest. Rose's kingdom sprawled to the east. Almas realized this was his shot to unload weapons at a solid price, then swap them for farming tools, rice included. and he and Griffin started planning to get. Griffin soared with Alma's to scout the spot, and the land immediately screamed one thing. Stick. Alma's busted the truth wide open. This village already had clean water. It just needed a few quick fixes, and most importantly, a clean stretch of land ready for rice to grow. He thanked Griffin for landing them in a place that beat expectations, and Griffin waved it off like it was no big deal. The very next day, Alma's marched the kids over. Still, the plan had a catch. Splitting the land into 4 sections for livestock cut the crop yield, but the payoff was huge. Getting animals was Rosewood's first move. When he heard, Ruru stared at an empty patch of land, wondering what Alma's had been doing for ages, and blurted out that he could raise goats there. Goats can live off bark, and Ruru questioned why they'd even bother needing animals, but Griffin snapped back that goat milk. Tastes awful. Still, and Griffin agreed without a second thought, just so they could bring Alma's her goats back. Alma's couldn't believe Griffin was even talking to the goats, until he realized Griffin was just herding them straight into the pen. He snapped at the loud kids to shut it and lock in on their own training. And the crazy thing is, everyone who followed through still crushed the village carried on until it was Graham's turn. He snapped everyone's attention and promised to teach them how to live peacefully, but that calm never lasted. He figured he could scare off a weak beast if it came for Rosewood, but if something stronger showed up, he'd fight like hell to make sure Rose got out. Then he got closer and he flashed a wicked grin, mocked Rosewood as a fool, and let slip that he already knew how packed those Alma's kids were with steel swords. Finally, I figured out what he was really trying to do. When they finally got there, he bolted forward and fought to save Rosewood. He yelled for the kid to run first, then stayed behind, throwing himself in the way to stop the furious man. He shoved himself up from the dirt, clutched a huge branch, and demanded if Alma's was stalling so Rosewood could slip away, and just traded it for food. Alma's figured everything was fine, even though he couldn't understand. But before he could react, Alma's drove a blade into him, forcing him to let the satisfaction and terror swirled inside Alma's, convinced that the man would show up the moment he sensed her feelings. So she hesitated, then reluctantly ended his life right there. Soon the kids rushed in, worried sick, and demanded, "Alma's, are you okay?" He told them, "I'm okay," and rushed to apologize for scaring. Rose sobbed hard, terrified something terrible would happen to Alma's. Alma's tried to steady the boy and told him everything would be fine, but he wasn't used to moments like this. Griffin showed up to size things up, shrugging like this wasn't new, and told Alma's, even though Griffin's words landed, they just felt like an oversimplification of human nature. Griffin said it wasn't natural for creatures to struggle to hurt their own kind. Half a month slid by, and even with a few hiccups in Alma's vegetable garden, they got everything fixed up. And when Alma's finally spotted it again, a burst of joy lit up her face. Ron, the leader, burst ahead and eagerly pointed to a clothing store, telling Alma's was told to stay calm, because this chaos, the nearest girl blurted in a rush, "Is it caramel grass?" She begged Alma's to sell her the potion and swear to her it wasn't the potion at all. It became hers the moment they closed the deal on the price, and Alma's leaned in. Yuria said that mixing it with marijuana turns the whole thing into a dangerously smooth addiction. Then Alma's shot back with, she gave a shaky answer about living in a village a day's travel away, then asked, straight. She praised his question and lit the way forward. This wasn't just about farming, they had to learn how to trade materials for real money. He marched up to Alma's to complain that he was being taught without any special treatment or real fairness. Then, true to his word from last month, Alma's chugged herbal. During this trip, Alma's couldn't stop herself. She wanted to grill Yuria about protection, and Yuria didn't know much at first, but the fairies, notes, and papers convinced her that they truly were kind. And when she checked Alma's protection, unfortunately, the king stepped in and shielded him, warning that the more faces that followed his lead, the more his powers would grow stronger. Alma's kept it secret, but she realized this was his way of forcing the kids to accept him as their leader. She lived out in the Griffin Forest territory in Romalia, and she wanted to find out. Yuria told him he could spot things from insanely far away, and that his shield was called the Eyes. Yuria was sure it wasn't just one person. It could hit the whole country, and a curse that big might snuff out. After that, Alma's dove right back into his building a kiln now was almost too easy. He didn't fully get what Carisha Yuria was talking. Still, he stood up in front of everyone and declared their new target. Shoot pottery. Because if they pulled it off, their roses, so where did these kids even come from? Soyen stood there, and when she heard it, Tetra gasped and asked again. Then tears burst into her eyes as she whispered, I know my parents loved me too. Seeing Tetra break down like this for the first time hit Alma's hard, and suddenly he was thinking about her future and the new kids who just arrived. So much to weigh before Alma's leaned in and warned the other kids to keep it normal and don't pull anything weird. Ramalia Forest is boxed in by 4 countries, and out of all of them, the Rose's kingdom. Yuria kept staring at all those huge houses nearby, and it took him forever to clock that this was. Yuria marched him straight to the king, and the king stared in pure amazement, bursting with joy that he'd finally met Alma. She dropped to one knee in front of the king, and he practically glowed, because you being there meant the world to him. Then the king told her this is the first time he's ever brought a friend home, because all he ever did was dive into studying magic, with 0 friends in sight. So yeah, she met the king, and he told her it was because she was Yuria's closest friend. He'd help however he could. So Alma swallowed her nerves and spilled everything that had happened. The king's eyes, he lowered his head and thanked Alma's for putting the nation's future first, and Alma's couldn't even process it. The king kept insisting that Alma's being his citizen was a prize beyond measure, one he'd protect. Next, the second demand was simple. Alma's had to stay friends with Yuria, while the last request pushed even harder. Teach the princess who'd come back. Alma's clocked it right away. Tetra's vibe had shifted in a big. Something about it wouldn't let her rest, like her peace was being yanked away, and he steps up to her and says, if you don't want to talk, I get it, but tell me what's her. He boldly declares, my name. Tetra suddenly gets it, her voice warm as she softly thanks him. I'll miss you, she says. She swears she knows her parents are already dead, but she can't make herself accept it. She clings to the hope that he was her father's close friend. Everyone liked him because he climbed from the. Alma's, who finally gets him, asks Tetra if he should strike back for her. So he snaps that he'd love to rip it into 100 pieces, but he refuses. He tries to comfort him, saying nobody's going to abandon Tetra, even as tears spill down his face, because his parents used. He declares, I'll protect everyone here, even me, then adds that Tetra's a genius, smarter than he'll ever be. After Alma's drops his honest opinion, Tetra grins and promises, right on the spot, that she'll protect everyone just like he told her seriously. And if she's set on revenge, Tetra finally admits with a shy little flinch that she never heard a word he said, because Alma's already tweaked. Months turned into years as Tetra's writing kept leveling up, and just when things finally looked brighter, a new crisis hit, especially because Griffin's support died off right on schedule after a single month. So Alma's village had to stand on its own. And today, that's exactly why the king said there wasn't a set deadline. Alma's would do it, or it wouldn't. He couldn't shake the worry. Was this really okay? But the king shut him down, telling him not to fret, because the whole kingdom already knew about. So it meant her future husband would rise as the next king. And yeah, the king tells Alma's that it's a nightmare. Everyone around here already knows the princess. And for she takes a huge leap of faith and asks the king about her village. He pauses, then calls it a good. Yuria gets invited to Alma's village and becomes her very first official guest. She's crossed paths with Ron and Rosewood a few times already, but now she's determined to meet the rest. So Yuria flashes a grin and jokes, yeah, I'm totally your girlfriend. Tetra hears it and out of sight smacks Alma's. Then Bolton, the guard who rode in with her, bursts out laughing and tells her she's famous enough to get trouble she can't handle. Alma's fired back, asking if Bolton's skills weren't already more than enough to guard. Alma's couldn't shake the feeling there was still something tucked away, and Tetra was too close to King Rose's. Hell, she was Princess Lego's daughter. Alma's wanted Tetra back in the Kingdom of Roses for her own happiness, but Tetra flat-out refused. She didn't want any. Alma's hissed that if Bolton ever found out about Tetra, the whole thing would explode into. He sat there listening to the kids chatter nonstop, then leaned in and grilled Alma's on what he had them playing next. After a quick pause, Alma's told Yuria to teach the whole village how to use. Alma's was aiming to train the villagers to stand on their own. He'd teach them math, sure, but maybe not everyone's built for it. But if men learn how to fight curses, they'll be useful fast. Standing beside Alma's, Bolton started talking, saying he could be a. Bolton was sure they'd recruit Alma's the moment he grew up, especially if the boy impressed them, because then the government might even hand him land. Bolton also laid out that their country was in chaos. Alma's figured being a government official didn't sound so bad, asterisk, as long as the whole village. When Bolton finally showed up, the princess and Alma's hit him with her brand new inventions, straight from her own The king leaned in and asked if his country could pull it off, only to be told the harvester wouldn't. The king snapped the conversation in a new direction and said it was all thanks to Alma's. Ever since he acted as a harvester, Alma's begged the king for a farming horse, and the king snapped to it. handing over 2 horses and a full. Alma admitted it wasn't strict at all. People could slip through a bunch of loopholes tied to family, but by the second or third generation, the whole thing was starting to fall apart. Right now, the king's soldiers and money are splintered all across the land, clutched by powerful families. So in a real war, he grilled Almas for his take on why this reform had to happen, and Almas fired back that the first thing they needed was rock-solid numbers, people the community actually trusted. Almas straight up demanded the king the exact time left, because the king, it's like he swears this training will sharpen his mind to crack this problem. And after he chops it up with King Almas, he rides back to the village with 2 horses. So loud, the villagers lit up the moment they saw the horses, and Ron burst out laughing. Graham burst out of the forest dragging a massive pig, then yelled that he'd trapped a wild pig himself. Ron spotted Graham hauling this huge, wild pig and just stared, shocked. "Who are you, man?" Because Graham almost grinned at the kids as they grew up, told them the talk was done, then sprinted back to the field with the 2 brand-new horses. Soyin pressed Almas, asking if he was working on anything else, and Almas admitted that next up is the hemp seed, small, round, and packed with nutrients. Once you plant it, it takes off fast, and after harvest, you can replant again. Almas told them they'd use it for fiber, not clothes, but he has no clue if it'll work like before since it's still stuck in the experimental stage. That's why they have to invent something new. So the second Almas clocked it, he threw himself into work, explaining that wrapping paper. Almas tells the king this is the village's newest masterpiece. And before he even finishes, the king gives an instant yes and agrees to buy it right away. And fires a question at Almas. Can he spill the paper-making secrets? Almas fakes a brutal headache and acts like it's no big deal, but here's the catch. Almas can't sell that paper to any other country, and a year has already gone by, and the whole point was to stop secrets from being sold to other countries the moment they appeared. When Griffin quit backing the village, everything crashed down in a sad spiral. I keep thinking, what if it never met Griffin in the Griffin Forest? After all, Griffin praised Almas hard, saying he ran the village. Right before heading out, Griffin looked Almas in the eye and demanded she come visit way more often. So he made sure to bring a bit of alcohol if Griffin's gift earned thanks. And when he got back to Alma, but none of that mattered, kids need their parents, period. Griffin's deal is over and these kids are finally allowed to come back home. Rose snapped Alma's name and scolded him for being foolish. Rosewood kept insisting on it even while they tried to love their parents because they knew the truth. Once you abandon, Rosewood shrieked that nobody had even considered heading back there. Everyone shouted the same thing in one breath. We love Almas, and we're not leaving on a day this. That tetra next to her was a total mystery, spilling magic everywhere to conjure food supplements she called miracle. Kids whip out their talents one by one. First, a fighter wearing animal fur boasts it can mask body odor. Then a girl leaps from rooftop or charges back out like an animal after the hunt. She bursts from the bushes to shower her with affection, but then she giggles and blurts that this is something Ruru has never. Alma suddenly snaps back and blares, "Wait, this is my technique." Like a revelation because she can Yeah, but she doesn't care at all. She just stares up and imagines an owl soaring in the sky, thinking it might be the wildest magic. Almas has no choice but to huddle in the corner, whispering through clenched teeth, acting like Ruru is done getting teased by Almas again, so she strides right up to her and fires off a question. A year later, the village has exploded in improvement. Now it's home to about 70 people from King Firm's kingdom. They packed up and vanished under the weight of crushing taxes. And when the villagers followed the trail, they stumbled on the 2 passed out in the forest. Then Tetra told Almas that among the newcomers, 6 strong. Then he chugs forest wine, determined to find the Griffin. After downing the wine, Griffin grins and calls it delicious, proof that the village is thriving. Man, he's ecstatic that they finally stand on their own and don't need him anymore. One day, Griffin finally has something urgent to tell Almas. Almas shoots out a grateful thank you, but clings to the hope that nothing like this will ever hit again. And Griffin's right there with him, swearing he never wants it to happen. Almas stumbles on the truth. This village is packed with fresh-faced adults who slipped away from the tight-fisted grip of the firm. This kingdom's cursed fate leaves it defenseless, and those dark hexes keep dragging the land into famine again and again. And the kingdom just kept cranking up the taxes. Miss a pain. Then the rumors hit hard. There was a forest village guarded by a griffin, and the orphan kids living there smiled all day. Right as that man pushed forward to beg Almas for help, he snatched her hand and demanded, "Are you Ruru?" But she erupted in a scream, swatting his grip away and yelling at him not to touch. Realizing it was already too late to play the mother role now that she'd been left alone, Ruru's biological mother was the very first one. Then the other kids jumped in too, terrified it'd wreck their bond with Soyan, but Tetra shot that down. Everyone was on the same page. She'd head straight to the company's kingdom to clear up everything she'd witnessed. Alma spotted Rhea and told her she had to grab a horse and head to the company with Tetra. Then Tetra froze. Alma's pulled out a pedal-looking device and assured her it was no big deal. It hooked onto both, but Alma's couldn't live like the old world anymore. Before pedals were invented, things were different. Not every Alma's kept quiet about it because he wanted nothing to do with the military grind. Then the Tetra, it looks like they act that way because they truly despise him. And before he became this kind-hearted guy, he was glued to his father and his. They sprinted straight into a village inside the kingdom, convinced it belonged to real true soldiers. The villagers told Almas they'd slipped out in the dead of night. Almas stepped in and offered to smooth things out, asking straight up if they planned to bring the ones who'd run back. Judging by the tire tracks, those people probably bolted straight into the forest. And maybe they really did believe Griffin was offering, and it wouldn't be hard to track them down because the royal company runs on wizards and hunting dogs. The soldiers hung their heads and admitted they understood. Yet the king would still drag. After the army hauled them back, those people dropped dead. Almas and Tetra snatched the clues fast, then sprinted back to the village to plot their next move. He warned the other kids that if they handed over those people, they were doomed. Almas made that crystal clear as he told his thoughts to 70 people. At that moment, every single person flipped their decision, nodded in agreement, and rushed to help, because they finally understood they had to unite. They screamed that it was pure cruelty to hand them over, and he grudgingly agreed. Because after the meeting wrapped up with Almas in the room, he swept in for a moment, caught everyone's eyes, and declared that everyone burst into cheers and shouted their thanks. And Almas lifted a hand for Ron burst into the room, panicking, shouting that the king's army was bearing down on them even now. She wasted no time. Anyone who showed up, she warned them the army was already on the way to capture. Panic ripped through the villagers. Could they really be trapped in this much danger after running this far? He bowed to Almas and blurted out an apology. Earl declared they'd back Almas's plan and help defend the place. Then Almas flashed a grin and asked him to help. Then they slipped into a hidden. Almas declared, "This is our home." And with time slipping away, Earl poured out every last thing he knew. Earl pushed for a meeting up front, trying to get everyone to see that negotiation beats fighting. But before any words, they were worried that even peace talks could sound like a provocation. With a regular army like that, they couldn't even move fast, so he kept most of his personal guards on him. They were the best he had, and the Earl yanked the ring out of him. Because that ring proved he struck a deal with King Fermi and marched with his army straight into the forest's pitch-black heart. And when he tried to a coworker pressed, "So you really mean to do it?" And he answered stone-calm, "Kill them all, then sure if he let them go." They'd finally be more ready to obey. Because this was urgent, even if the work was brutal, and they had. When he saw his soldiers' determined faces, pride surged through his chest. Then he demanded to hear what the king's fury toward the family just kept growing. Because Lagos wasn't incompetent, he was simply too obedient. People already swore the kid was dead for good. As they kept talking, the guide abruptly stopped, pointed out, "I found it." And then all of them froze. The forest king froze in shock and demanded it again. Is that the village people swear is guarded. It all started with a sickening dread. Because the king was convinced the war was impossible. He'd never once gotten lost in that forest. And then he stumbled onto Griffin. They laughed and hurried along, and pretty soon they spotted the village, smiling at how the houses and fields matched what they'd guessed. Watchtowers and fences pop up all over the place, all built to keep the wolves out. Right now, the villagers stand fully armed and ready to fight. Exactly like the king barked at his soldiers, "Don't do a thing I wouldn't do." Alma strode up to the front, then introduced herself like the village leader, clear, bold, and impossible to ignore. The king snapped that he'd only come to punish anyone who ran from the country, but the curious king beckoned Almas forward and demanded he speak. He never thought Almas would show up for real, yet he stared in awe at her nerve. While Almas prayed the whole plan would run clean, Almas stepped up and told the king he was honored to meet him, then asked if he couldn't shake the need to figure out why Almas refused his request. Because in Almas's eyes, this was the one real shot for the king to finally hear what Almas. So it was just a tiny village. If the king really wanted them gone, could he even forgive? He begged the king to punish them but spare their lives. Then handed over the ring Earl had given him. The king paused for a heartbeat, then barked an order at Almas. "Hand over every ring and everything else you own in that village." Almas couldn't believe it. Of course Earl would spare everyone and even hand out clothes. And as he thought about it, he knew every word Earl said had to be true. With a steady voice, Almas warned the king that if he seized it all, everyone would die, and told him to keep. And he warned that if the king wanted it all, he'd command the village to be burned to ash. The king bought it without doubt, and he knew the village of Almas wasn't strong enough to survive that, but he only agreed to take 70%. Almas thought it was still a lot, yet it was still enough to seal the deal. Once the deal was done, Almas finally exhaled. No fight, no. Earl couldn't shake the question. Did Almas even know King Roses? So Earl asked to tag along, but Almas shut it down, saying it'd be better to talk in private. Tetra stopped him mid-step, heart pounding, and then, once she found her nerve, told him she'd go with Alma too, because she didn't trust him at all, so she made him say it again. Tetra told him she'd mulled it over the whole journey, opening up and sharing everything she could with Almas. Because he keeps, but right now the refugees are getting crushed by and spilling his thoughts on how painfully alone her life really is. Tetra flat out declares that if she doesn't want to do something, nobody, literally nobody, can force her. And she's done living in fear of the king. She's ready to. She can't stop wondering if Almas will finally marry her once he's done fixing. Almas snaps his horse to a halt, stunned, and insists it matters to him, but not in the usual family. He's always treated Tetra like family too, more like a sister. The same way he sees Ron and Soyan, because in there, after a while, Almas plants his feet and declares, loud and clear, that as a man, he simply can't accept Tetra's proposal. He's basically demanding that the person who said those words marry her. No excuses. Tetra's face lights up when Almas announces they've agreed to marry, and that they've got to do it fast. They have to meet King Rose, because he hasn't forgotten that every single person is in danger right now. Almas lays out every nightmare the village is stuck in. Food and supplies are gone, one crisis after another. And King Rossi's keeping the refugees safe is a daily sight right by the ruthless border. So when he saw they didn't torch the village like he couldn't collect taxes from the dead, all confused, the girl blurted out that 10 whole years had passed since the king last showed up at her house, when he met her and her father. The king's face snapped into a warning, saying she'd be punished if she lied. Then he demanded Tetra's family name and covered his own eyes, shouting. Almas burst out laughing, telling her he didn't blame her. And there was no anger in him at all. Still, the king couldn't wait, snapping that the king's move was pure centralization, put all national power under the central government, so he could command the army with iron control and squeeze taxes cleanly for King Ra. And to bring it all together, they've got to unite. But even when the king calls the family in, they won't always back him, so you've got to slowly strip that. Almas said with zero hesitation, that when the people gain real political power, the royal family's grip starts. The king's family is freaking out because his power might start slipping, and Almas just shrugs it off. I don't care about that. Almas thinks it could happen, but his gut screams that conflict between the two powers is more likely. Because their reach usually. Almas swore a bunch of people in Adelia were hungry for Republican ideas. But the king shot his prediction down. Meanwhile, Raymond flat out disagreed, challenging those smooth notes and pushing a different take on the influence. Right now, their worst headache isn't outside enemies. It's the. Ramon's POV doesn't turn out so bad once he hears Alma's speech. Almas practically roars, I'll take you as my own. Even if Almas isn't the king's first pick, the second he's on the table, he's not some villain, and the king agrees. He refuses the claim that Almas is just a normal guy, because yeah, the kid's a genius. Raymond, 1 year older, pounces on the next king question and fires back about his younger brother right away. The first pick is Raymond. Seriously, this dude is a total maniac. Always chasing money, downing alcohol, and chasing women. Raymond snorts at Victory's demand, and the wipeout of family Diable is the final straw that proves him right. He keeps pressing his brother, asking if he truly wants to marry him, the same daughter whose father butchered 2 of the king's wives. The king doesn't even want this, unless their marriage goes right. So Debal, the king admits going too deep might not be the smartest move. But he can't stop wondering why his brother dragged in a brand new young guy for the plan. Raymond starts digging into Almas, Griffin's second son, because the kid has divine influence. Even though the young man might help, Raymond can't shake the fear of tearing his family apart. When he lays it out, but Almas and Tetra flip the script with their old backup plan, teaming up with the Ash family. Even after the Ash family got stripped of their political power, the twist was deadly simple. But the king needs more time to stare down the throne. So he calls Almas back and tells him he's been demoted to a Raymond's. Right after Almas storms back to the village from the royal palace, He hears Ruru's. Ron bursts in and says two of Ruru's relatives won't stop trying to get close to her. So everyone piles together to come up with a plan. So they basically forced Almas to realize this. If it keeps going like this, they're getting kicked out of the nearby village. He couldn't stop wondering how Almas would handle this. Until Almas told him that the moment more people crowded the village, they'd need law. Almas could have cleared this up fast just by asking Bartolo what he thought. So Bartolo pitched a plan. Almas leaned in and asked, "So, Bartolo, how's it going now?" And Bartolo said even though he's a former army commander who's never once crossed the border, everyone still worships his name. Almas even laughs that somehow that fact won't scrub his drum. Almas snapped up the idea fast, seeing it as perfect. Surprisingly, Bartolo snapped Almas' attack aside with a single strike, and kept yelling. Almas steps in and points out that he can stay rock steady even after seeing his power. So if this ever turns into a real fight, Almas will struggle to beat him without leaning on his own raw strength. Almas begs to join his troops, swearing he wants to fight right by his side. It's not the same blessing at all. It boosts men's physical strength, but it dials up voodoo power for the women. Everyone already knows Uriah's going to marry Regar, and the king orders Raymond to shut it and stop stirring up point. When Almas finally gets a breather, he keeps building all kinds of weapons and gear for Tetra, the outsider who showed up in town. And Tetra wastes. He thought it was fine to tell him his black powder was black powder, when black powder was first made in China, and at first he didn't want to drag military tech into this world. But the king's relentless. It was built from charcoal, sulfur, and potassium nitrate, like a nightmare recipe that shouldn't exist. After breaking it down, Almas grabbed Tetra and whisked her out of his research zone. As they backed away, the black powder detonated in a violent blast. Almas leaned in and warned Tetra that even a tiny bit. A month later, Almas rolled out his invention for Bartholo, only for Bartholo to cut in and say he was crafting tactics to finally take down King Ferme. Almas pressed him. Did he understand the plan for those failed shield and spear tactics against the left enemy, where Bolton admitted they always tried to handle it in a supportive way, but in the end, battle outcomes still crashed down on luck. Then Almas fired off the idea. Almas snapped out of it and remembered. He wasn't here to talk about the battle at all. Almas and the villagers kept pushing through their preparations for the battle on the horizon, still 2 long years away. The company's king shot past in a rush, clutched by fresh news. Another clan had flipped to the Ash family's side. 2 years had already crawled by since Tetra was found. He guessed the king had been sick for ages, and that felt like the perfect opening, because he told me the brutal part wasn't the danger. It was finding the secret route through the forest, and that clue only surfaced because deserters spilled it. Griffin, so the king hauled him in and demanded why he didn't show up the last time they swept almost all their food. He warned that right when it was about to come back, the witch got attacked, and she couldn't stop trembling, wondering why they were all suddenly terrified. The witch felt it hit her. Those eagles weren't supposed to fly together. Their endless show of strange magic proved the voodoo witch's power. No way a tiny village. After Graham and Ruru pulled off the surveillance bird capture, Ruru's mind raced. What if it ripped them apart and set Fermi off? In the royal palace, the Earl demanded immediate help on the spot. Right when Earl dashed back to say the reinforcements would hit in 3 days. On top of all that, neighboring countries and rival clans threw their weight into the mix. And King Ferme lined up the troops he'd promised, swearing he'd rally 3,200. Capital S in panic. Our army fears that calling up all 32,000 troops leaves them tapped out, while the enemy. So yeah, Modal's second biggest power won't lift a finger and won't show up for the fight. The king can't shake the worry that Rieger might flip on them, maybe just to win the Reese's people over with trust, and with troops kicked out and everyone refusing to join in. He figures there are probably only about 4,000 people still left in the capital. When the word hit the streets, everyone jumped to their feet and swore. If it's right after that, Almas spotted 200 soldiers marching toward the village from the guard tower. Right on cue, just like they'd warned him. The villagers panicked about what to do next, so someone even pushed the idea that Ruru should morph into an eagle, and Almas saw it. Where the king's crew should have been, there was nothing but strangers in the oncoming line, and the one leading them didn't feel like royalty, more like a commander. Then that leader snapped and forced them to hand over every last bite. Then Almas flat out refused. The enemy forces hit like a thunderclap, and at first they stumbled right into. The villagers hurled stones at the enemy's shield to keep danger back. but it only left them trapped in chaos, and wave after wave of people got smashed and injured. Almas then snapped. Ron kept pelting them with stones without. Raymond saw this chance and immediately thought, "This is how I level up politically." Then the truth hit him. Then a soldier burst in with news from Almas. Somehow, Raymond was so stunned by the news he kept yanking the soldier back for another repeat. Because no matter how unshakable he was, Almas knew one thing for sure. He was a military genius, so they didn't stand a chance if their troops. Raymond went along with the commander's demand and chose his own son. Now they were 2 years have cracked by, and he's taken Almas in. Now she's soaking up military tactics like it's second nature. Raymond said he'd put Bartholomew and Burroughs at his side as Almas's commanders, backing him up on the battlefield, so they could call. Almas heard that a few friends from his village also wanted him to join Raymond's smiles. So he laughed it off, saying a guard was no trouble. Almas and his troops got ready to ride at once, right before they left, and Raymond snapped at his son. "Don't you dare die out there. Stay alive until you reach me," as he rode beside Almas. Almas wouldn't stop pestering if his feet were cold, and Barthela snapped, dead serious, that he better quit. Almas rallied his troops and split them toward their assigned routes, then told Bartholomew, "You may not get the command." Bartholomew snapped at him, reminding him of Raymond's orders. Don't put his own son in. After thinking it over, Bartholomew finally nodded and decided Almas's raw strength should be enough. Soyon strode forward and announced he'd spotted the enemy, still an hour out in Bartholomew, and everyone hailed him as a truly skilled wizard, while Almas's rise began by becoming Raymond's. With a great wizard and warrior right beside him, he almost warns that it isn't some effortless. Almas's eyes went wide the moment he saw just how advanced their equipment was. Bartholomew coolly lays out the company's rule. Keep the warriors rattled with the constant lure of battle or the fear of hunger. Almas roars at the top of his lungs to get everyone into formation exactly like they planned. Tetra looks baffled and blurts, "What plan are you talking about?" Almas stays unshaken and says, "No plan." After 2 years of brutal training, Almas, the company's king, feels something is terribly wrong as forces slam into his right wing. Because Rosewood he lets out a laugh and goes, "That strategy is actually brilliant." And then they warn him, if that's the right wing is just the weakest link in the whole lineup. Sure, it looks shaky from the outside. The moment the battle starts, Rhea slams into the front line and charges straight at the enemy. Rosewood, her loyal companion, stays right behind her, barking warnings to Rhea. "Don't let your go." He orders her to step back and hands the front line over to her. Soon the enemy finally sees it. Rosewood is freakishly strong. One of them yells that it's the truth. She's too. Almas is convinced that only the two of them can crack the chaos on the left wing. So when a soldier barrels up and says the enemy infantry is closing in, she snaps to use explode. King Ferme is left staring in shock as non-stop explosions tear his troops straight off the ground. He blares that they won't ever close in and snatch his shield, then charges right at them, sworn to stop it with his own hands. The company snaps to attention and realizes he's the one calling the shots, the leader of Almas. The villagers burst into cheers, swearing he's Griffin's real son, adopted by Raymond, the protector of the Tetra, and he's got a. Almas keeps yelling at the top of his lungs that he's the supreme commander of the army too. King Ferme spots the danger right away. This move will yank the enemy's attention. So it snaps the enemy's focus away, while Rhea and Rose would slip in, silently pick off their cavalry. The moment the company realized what was happening, it was all. Fermi joked that it was downright terrifying, but he brushed it off. Almas couldn't fight on the battle. Almas slammed into an all-out assault on Fermi, firing aggressive questions like, "Do you really think?" Almas snapped back that if they swung with their full power, their spear would shatter. So they forced themselves to hold back, praying it would. Even with everything happening, the company's moves were still easy to read. They'd been locked in, studying Almas' fighting style, spotting every crack. The king flat out said Almas had zero chance, and Almas nodded to the company's fact. This surprise strike caught them off guard, and it shoved Almas into. He shattered their spear with one crushing blow, then barked. Almas snapped, asking if they were really sure, warning that the company would regret it the moment they got pushed into a one-on-one. To lift his soldiers' spirits, Almas whipped his sword through the air with flawless skill from a distance. He decided against it, because with his razor-sharp spear techniques and sharp eyes, this might be his shot to flip the whole game. He'll dare the king's crew to notice the huge gap. Almas tried to keep his distance, but with a shocking burst, Almas smiled and said he'd stolen those kendo footwork tricks, clean in the dojo, brutal on the. Almas knew he might not be the best commander or strategist, But his power was, he had one dream, fusing half the island, and he begged Almas to carry. Before the forgiving company crumpled and died, they blasted out one last message. But Almas, if he wanted to be carved into history, Almas roared for everyone to snap back into their fight on the battlefield. And Ron gripped his sword so hard it ached. News hit like thunder. Report after report screamed that the enemy's right wing was shattered, and every signal pointed straight to where they'd run. After the incident, Bartholo was still almost stared at his homeland as the villagers came rushing in, one by one, like the whole world just pulled up at once. He sprinted to hug Tetra, floods of relief hitting him because not a single soul. Ruru said it felt like the whole country was partying over their people's joy, and Almas, scribbling on Tetra, told him, "Don't ignore what the people think." In just a month, the company's residents were shoved under the Rose's empire's rule, and everything finally clicked. Then the wedding day of Almes and Tetra crashed. Everyone cheered as the ceremony blessed them. And the grand finale had him taking prayers and blessings. A soldier stormed in with a gift and blurted out that one family couldn't make it. And Almas instantly knew it was from the Dibble family, the same ones who didn't show up at the. Everyone kept staring at family Dibble's weird stance afterward, and he replayed their wild journey out of the Romalia forest, and genuinely thanked everyone for. Meanwhile, King Roses fumed and snapped at his brother Raymond over what he did while the king was out cold. Raymond shot back. He ordered Raymond to head off and tell everyone to get ready for their wedding somewhere else. And then Say slipped into Claris, the bustling trading city, smiling like pure joy. The gatekeeper told him the city doors were wide open for him, no entry fee at all since only traders paid up. But if Seimei planned to stay past a month, he'd have to cough up taxes. The gatekeeper kindly warned Seimei about two kinds of people in the city, who pays taxes and who should be avoided. Isma begged Seimei to let him in, saying the city's crawling with architects too. And as a woman, she won't get a real chance for it. So she's determined to prove her talent in some overlooked place like where they're headed. No matter how rage burned in him, he snapped at Raymond, accusing him of abusing his power and demanding to know how he could hand over vital land to someone with a mystery past. Then Raymond stayed ice-calm and told him Almas had all. The Regar snapped back hard, grilling Almas about his status before he got adopted, and then slapping the word orphan onto him like it was a verb. Raymond shot back, asking how Almas could possibly be a parent when he's Griffin's son. Then he reassured him, saying Almas would be totally fine and that the military advisor and the council would back him up. Al's brutal new battles made his advisor role, especially in peace talks, absolutely vital. Raymond demanded a vote, and the Regar exploded with rage, while Raymond fumed and cursed silently in his heart. Raymond backed everyone's opinions, because he was the king's brother, and he sat right beside him. He told the rigger to keep his cool and trust that the king only had 2 years left, then insisted that once the king was gone, Raymond would be stripped. The Regar shot him a question, would he stand by him? And he didn't hesitate. My whole life is bound to serve the Diable family, the strongest clan out there. And he'd back the next king, no question. But he still warned the rigger about Almas, brushing him off as no real win and calling him luck, and so he had to tread carefully in every word he said to his brother, the King of Roses. The king could hardly believe Raymond's brutal move. Then Raymond dropped to his knees, begging his brother to let. He basically said, "It's gonna happen," grinning because she was right there with him. Then after that, Earl figured those lush forests would soon be theirs, so he stayed in the village. He couldn't believe every last refugee had picked that same choice. And then, sure enough, it played out exactly how he'd feared they'd. But Tetra's homeland, somehow, didn't shock her at all, because life in Alma's village felt smoother and more comfortable. Alma flashed a smile and said this wasn't just his job. It was everybody's, so he went first and asked what he should do with his position. Burroughs then stepped into place exactly how his advisor. Then he added that Almas had to juggle the brutal assessments and the taxes they owed King Roses. Bartholo leaned in and promised him they could handle the job, backing, and Almas wouldn't have to face all of this solo. Bartholo told Almas his next job was to revive the kingdom under his young rule. Almas snapped together a paper form and got the population survey ready to go. They logged every crucial detail, age, gender, and economic status, then kept marching. Alma's barked an order to use one plain form. People only had to type the numbers they thought were even. Tetra blurted out, "Do we really have to do all of this by hand?" And Alma's grinned, "Nope, we're not." Ron and Rosewood both nodded that this plan could actually work. Then the real headache hit: the tax rate. Since the company rules label the ash with a 10% tax on the harvest, pulling double duty, as the land and labor instead, they want to squeeze a huge chunk of land tax out of owners through forced collection. Bartholomew nodded and promised to breathe life back into the land, then hit him with Almas is gearing up to spread their tools everywhere, including rice threshers. But that move could slam a ton of. He'll still funnel subsidies to them, rake in bigger capital gain. Almas's eyes flared the second he mentioned alcohol. He was the first one brave enough to taste the drink Almes brewed, and when Almes admitted alcohol, Almas grinned and said copper will do, then paused to admit he admitted he's basically clueless about this stuff, since he's only a nominal commander. Since Almas took the crown, this was the first time the weight of his duty hit him. Protect the land, shield the people. They need weapons, sure, but before anything else they need soldiers. Ron shot back, "So what are we doing about that?" After thinking for a second, Bartholomew snapped back that they've got about 50,000 soldiers. But with their huge territory and countless enemies out there, Tetra said that when they fought firm, they handled it clean with 3,000 soldiers. No sweat at all. And Bartholo leaned in and told them not to panic. This region's. He asked Almas what he thinks about the soldiers who served the company after their deaths. Because once some sharp-minded people grabbed that wasteful advice and turned it into a weapon. Almas pushes him to beef up every resource he can. Finances, the whole magic circle. So Tetra snaps that she'll handle the magic circle. Almas fires back that they've got the money to pay, and even more capital. Almas tells them, don't sweat the negotiations, because King Roses has already hooked them up with a merchant in Clare. The second they meet the merchant, they waste no time and straight up he proves he can sell it for double the price of papyrus. Almas realizes this won't conquer the whole market, but the wine will rake in serious profit. He proposes to sell it for a jaw-dropping 20 times the usual price, but Almas slams back with a price tag at least 30 times higher. So big it Aints nods at once with an understanding smile, not totally sure what it means, but knowing full well. The seasoned merchant flashes a paper tallying what the Ash residents can scrape together right now, and Almas they knew Z would back it as long as they could squeeze out a little profit. Weeks have already roared by since then, and now Almas sits on the throne of the Ash territory, running it with. The village chief slaps 4 huge bags into Ron. Soyen says they checked afterward, and they found at least 10 more bags like that missing. Ron explodes in rage and confronts the village. Ron, seething with rage, barks at the elder to be arrested after the man refuses to admit even after they cuffed him, the elder still claws for proof, the evidence Ron has. The chief marched in and accused him of embezzlement, a serious crime. But when the heat came down, the village chief, he praised Ron as a good soul, then slid him a share like. Soyen stood nearby and slapped the elder with bribery on top of everything else. 70 lashes. Ron and Soyen met Earl right after he arrived, and they told him they blew off steam, admitting this was their 12th hit. Still, they couldn't deny Ron and Soyen's had busted their backs. Farmers' tax burden finally started to feel justified for a change, and the Uniform Equipment Initiative was kicking into high gear. Burroughs told everyone they'd managed to snag top-notch steel by borrowing money, then turned around and started forging rice thrashing machines, so they could sell or rent them to any. With cutting-edge tools, farmers finally wrestled life from barren land, and the harvests shot up. Right after he finished his report, Burroughs leaned in and reminded Almas that the Harvest Festival was. Almas nodded at the whole situation, basically saying, let's dodge trouble if we can. But admit that announcement hit the crowd like a bomb. Some people panicked, fearing war would be next, while others raged. They made it crystal clear, joining wasn't forced, only men from 15 to 30 could enlist. The pay came in grain, God would hand out the weapon. Rosewood said, if you want in, tell the village chief within 2 weeks, then we'll pick 300 people if more folks. The villagers pressed Rosewood to let them skip registration, and he cut them off with a blunt, no, you don't have to register. That was huge relief for everyone stuck in the fields, Ron voiced his worries that they might not have the resources to suddenly. Ron, serving in the military, pushed again, will everything be okay? Almas grinned and praised him for more than just job worries. They still haven't diversified their income. Wine sales, paper, and taxes are all jammed together like a mess of orders. So the whole place spiraled. Almas told everyone that Burroughs has never led the cavalry, and because Rosewood came from humble roots, he's the perfect horse. Explaining that they'd been picked as war slaves for their sheer quality, Almas told Rhea to once everything was set, Rosewood stepped up and told them he'd be their manager and that they'd be thrown into the cavalry unit. He promised them that if they performed at their best, those rebellious slaves from before dug in and promised to work, on one wild condition. They'd only hand their efforts over to someone who could actually grant them real freedom. Rose agreed. If Verger could beat him in battle, he'd win his freedom. If he couldn't, he'd be forced to obey Rhea. Rose would rush to fill Alma's in on everything. And just like that, the whole crew swarmed together. Rosewood didn't just win. He mopped the floor with the match, flashing lightning-fast, razor-sharp combat moves that left the Aints clocked the moment Rosewood slipped the hit, then snapped back with a brutal counterattack. Ein realized normal people couldn't pull off feats like that, and he told himself Rosewood's balance came from back at Ash Palace. Almas and Tetra lit up with big smiles as soon as they returned, welcoming them like they'd been waiting all day. Almas told them Rosewood was good to go for the cavalry training, saying the military and political situation. Now that Almas is a lord, he can't shake one worry. Strangers might show up and threaten his. Curious as hell, Almas pressed Soyen for answers. So the woman was an architect, the man an explorer from the Scarlet Empire, and she actually wanted that. A self-proclaimed world explorer was out there bragging like he'd crossed every single continent. Almas pulled him into his office for a meeting, where the architect introduced himself and started flexing, showing sketches of houses, bridges, and wild siege. The architect didn't sugarcoat it. He'd rather build his name in a smaller company in a small kingdom than end up just another nobody in a giant one. Almas clocked that, then he leaned in and introduced himself as Sima, telling us he'd trekked he'd just finished hunting down the end of the world. And now he couldn't afford fancy old stuff like sheepskin or papyrus, so he hunted down a sheet of paper. Almas smelled a chance to blow up his name, so he agreed to give them the paper. On one while, after plotting their trip to Rock's capital to join the Harvest Fest, Raman stood guard at the gate, grinning as he welcomed his son back and admitting it had been forever. Right before he left, he leaned in and told his father, "Don't you drink too much." Raymond's rushing out of Tetra. Raymond scanned the crowd, buzzing with the question of whether this was where the power. And Almas lit up with a grin as he told Tetra that right now they needed more allies. Almas shoved 2 drinks into the table and asked Tetra which one he wanted, while Tetra's eyes snagged on all the kids packed in with their parents at the party. Then Almas blinked in confusion and demanded to know why the kids needed to start with a boy or a. He told them, if you get a boy first, you follow with a girl next. Tetra leaned in and demanded Almas's plan. What happens after that? Almas smirked and shot back, asking if he was plotting a whole. Almas told them to drop the whole topic for now since the party was still going, and pushed them to grab something. Right then, a crowd surged up to Almas and demanded he recount his battle with King Fermi. Almas weighed the heavy truth in his heart, but all he wanted was for Tetra to smile. So he said he loved her out loud. The crowd kept pressing, asking if Almas still didn't have the right air, and soon other girls chimed in, pushing the idea that someone else should handle him. Then Almas caught the real reason fast. He got trapped in the middle of the crowd, shoved right up to the edge. Tetra yanked Almas out with pure urgency. Saying she'd been dying to. Almas finally burst out of the non-stop noise, and he couldn't stop thanking his wife over and over. Tetra stared at Almas and told him, "Go ahead. If you really want to marry again, I won't stop." Right as their conversation was still in full swing, Rhaegar burst onto Tetra's side. He leaned in and murmured about his own arrogance, wondering why he dragged so many servants with him, then nearly warned that the guy was pure rigor. When he finally caught up, they erupted into big, happy laughter, cheering. She clutched Alma's hand like a lifeline, forcing a smile that couldn't hide her regret, while secretly twisting her finger to cue him to take care of himself. Origar screamed in agony. He let go and started blasting Almas with furious, loud curses, pulling every one of his subordinates' eyes to him. As he walked out, Almas leaned in and told Ron, "Don't let them bait you. Stay sharp," because Yuria then grinned at Almas and Tetra, scanning the room as Rhaegar started flirting up a storm with a few girls. Almas convinced himself it was simple. He wanted to spend most of his time with the kids at Griffin's orphanage, to see him smile again. Right before he left, Yuria shoved a folded piece of paper into his palm and demanded he meet her. Popel stormed up to Almas and demanded he spill the whole. He replayed the last words of the King of Fermi to Almas, urging him to make him happy. Alma's mulled it over, even with that heavy truth pressing down on him, and deep in his heart, he just wanted Tetra to be happy. Tetra paused, then sat right in front of Almes and declared, "I'm your wife." And with that, she made it clear she had far less. Almas begged Tetra to spill his real feelings, but he refused to pressure his wife into saying anything she wasn't ready to share. Tetra poured out her love for Almas, the guy who always made the smart calls, and she was so sure everything would be okay the moment he took the lead. She knew some people weren't strong enough for that kind of call, and yeah, it happens, but she refused to let him toss his own choices to someone else. Tetra told him straight. Almas had to decide for Yuria on his own, and stops deep in the Romelia forest. Almas gritted his teeth and set out on a quest to hunt down Griffin. After some time, he finally spilled every last detail to Griffin. Then Griffin caught on fast. Almas was set, but Yuria was the boss's daughter. So if Almas wanted her, he'd have to join the group as a brand new face, and everyone would start butting heads with him every week until war finally erupts. Almas agreed. Griffin shrugged and demanded whether Almas would actually follow his advice, only for Almas to slam the brakes on that idea, saying Almas warned that if this went wrong, it could spark a war, and it would put them in the crossfire. Griffin made it clear they'd either help Almas or they wouldn't, based entirely on what they chose. And Almas didn't have to stress anymore. Griffin just couldn't wrap his head around why. Almas slammed his fist down and swore he had to win. Griffin's past words still rang in the air, he who killed without an ounce of guilt, while Griffin had been listening the whole time. He finally admitted he'd said those words to humans, pack creatures. Some of them slaughtered without a shred of remorse. Griffin says there's only one person who can move them, and he doesn't play by the group's usual rules. So whether Almas is in, he has to stand guard for his herd and keep his eyes locked on the bigger picture, not the petty stuff. Griffin snaps at him to listen close, because if there's ever anything that can't be allowed into this world, it won't even be. When Almas hesitates on a choice, regret crashes in, because the worst pain is freezing up or handing the decision to Griffin. Like if he doesn't decide fast, he'll end up regretting it either way. Almas knows both choices bite back, and in the kingdom of King Roses, he leans in and asks Almas if he's finally made up his mind. But Almas first thanks him for even thinking about his decision, even though she knows his request is painfully embarrassing. Then he boldly asks for Yuria's hand in marriage, and the whole country instantly turns to Yuria, begging her to answer. Raymond bursts into laughter, realizing he almost pulled the trigger faster than he ever expected. Because Yuria, totally thrown off, pressed King on the spot. Did he really give her just 3 days, or did he? Almas stared at Yuria, softly called his name, and Yuria cracked up, convinced that when the clock was ticking he'd finally choose. While she totally brushed off her own daughter's ridiculous, the king genuinely wanted to thank everyone who helped Almas make that life-changing decision. He asked how Almas planned to rule after becoming king, and Almas shot back that Alma pushed them to blitz the event right now and wrap it up in 2 days, and the king nodded grimly. Because if they truly he shot Almas a question. Would he really slam together an army right after the coronation and march it to? But then trouble hit. Almas had no real war wins to prove he was throne-worthy. The king warned. Almas had to tell Tetra the truth and keep the whole mess under wraps, while Tetra sat there listening as Yuria admitted straight up that she wanted Almas and the chance to become his main wife. Because once Almas, Tetra kept insisting that status didn't matter, love did, and Yuria's face tightened because she knew exactly what Tetra was. Almas steadied them and promised that Yuria and Tetra could carry on as usual after this. Then he hauled everyone in. Ever since Soyan heard Yuria was marrying the Regar, worry had been gnawing at him. Until this news Rosewood, the serious one, leaned in and grilled Almas. So did he finally decide to go to war against DB? Almas lunged into Tetra's arms and declared, breathless, that she was still his wife. No main wife label could change that, and he'd never ever reject her. And then he burst out, saying he was overjoyed that Princess Yura finally found her prince. But everybody knew this wasn't as simple, but every other noble family would rise up and shut it down. So Almas had to craft the ultimate move. Gilbert barked orders for every villager to gather, then stared at the fresh grain tax he'd just collected as he accused the village chief of fraud. They caught up with Gilbert and cornered the tribal chief, asking what this was all about. Gilbert, stone-cold calm, tossed them seeds and declared they'd be forced to repay next year, with interest that would bite. He snapped to attention and realized the fortress builders were using a technique that was nearly too. Alma's nodded right away and promised, "I'll go." Ismia practically buzzed with excitement and said she could wrap up her design fast by tweaking it to match the new version. Burrows said around 200 people were there. And right now, D had gone silent, so he had to tread carefully, without stressing that someone would run to the rumors about Alma. They fled to the Almes region because they'd finally hit the wall on rent. Almas was completely baffled by those wild taxes. Will Almas finally admit he gets it? So Earl, who went to investigate, sometimes they got so desperate they even had to sell their own children. Almes leaned in and asked Burrows what he really thought, and Burrows snapped back that ever since the Lagos government, House D had. Now everyone's dying to know what Almas will do next. Because Almas decided, just like Rhea said, to settle the refugees in a forest village. Then Rhea dashed off, thinking Rhaegar would calm down once he was full. They decide to drop their guard. Rhaegar seemed way more obedient than anyone expected, and Almas can't shake the weird feeling. They know the truth, but Almas swears he'll never show it, especially to fool. Almas doesn't need to hear the truth. He's sure he will, but if he spots even one refugee, he's reporting. Almas and Tetra stood tall as the Rhaegars marched off, and they couldn't believe it. These refugees weren't their trap after all, at least not this time. Rhaegar storms back into his territory fuming, barks at every. Still, the Rhaegar managed to warn them in silence, just in time. He says that the next time Almas causes trouble, they can point to this and use it to back up a fool. A week later, everything flips to serious when a massive wave of Dibble refugees. Almas says he almost never hears words like that from him. But when he finally arrived, he got hit with the news that Bemet told him to bring his troops here. So Almas stayed cool. Almas said he could only pray nothing terrible would happen. Then desperate cries for help and mercy tore through the air. And when Bartholomew saw the refugees already, Ron yelled at Almas, begging them to save. Out of all the young men who showed up at the river's edge, he was the one whose wife had been snatched a few days back, right when his wife came home. She hanged herself on the spot, and he crumpled. He couldn't take it. Then he hatched a bold plan to yank Gilbert's attention and make the soldier fire. He kept firing arrows, then finally sprinted straight toward Almas, right as he tossed one into the river to counter Gilbert's assault. When an Ash tribe fighter who still had an arrow knocked stepped up and demanded. He snapped, "I don't buy it. This wasn't an accident." Then leaned in and asked if that move could light the. He thrust the arrow high and screamed for everyone to listen. The next day in the Kingdom of Roses, the king warned that a real ruler must never act. Instead of getting hit with something harsher, the king ordered a holy duel to settle it once and for all, meaning Almas had to fight to prove who was right and who was wrong. That's why Almas set his sights on this duel, because he couldn't forget that arm wrestling showdown from the party. Almas fired off a question about the rules for the first duel, and Yuria hit him with the details. Almas can pick any weapon he wants, but because of an old. Alma nodded and agreed to the duel. Then the king promised he'd tell the rigger, and the fight would kick off in a week. Everyone huddled up. He finally got it. He didn't need a sword to sell, he needed it to use. Griffin handed Almas a huge stack of swords, the only ones he had that could bite back. The day of the duel was here in a blink, and Yuria made it crystal clear. He'd admit where he messed up, because he was the one who'd lose. Almas thought this was his very first duel against someone with a blessing, especially one matching the blessing of his own sword. And he figured a normal weapon would get him crushed. No, Almas snapped to it. Rhaegar's kryptonite was right there. He kept yanking through all these pointless moves. Almas ended the fight in a flash, slamming the door on Rhaegar's. The sacred duel snapped shut with Almas winning. And just like that, Family Diable got forced to hand over. Almas stared at Rhaegar, seething at the anger he'd sparked, and realized his own autocratic rule was the real cause of everything. Almas never thought the king would snap at his own family for cheering his courage. The king said it was smarter for Almas to spare Rhaegar, because if he'd killed him, more people would have turned on him, even though Almas still went and killed Rhaegar. Family D's hatred wasn't done yet. They pressed the king and demanded to know what good Rhaegar's surrender in the sacred duel ever brought. And then he asked, straight up, if surrendering in the duel was really that terrible. Rai leaned in and told his son to listen close, because the people owed two things, but he got crushed in a fight with the king. So from that moment on, he had every right to. Yuria practically begged her father to tell her he was serious, and the king answered word for word like before. No, and their marriage would be announced any day now. I asked if Almas should pull off something legendary, and yeah, the nobles trust him a lot too, because that man is the reason. Lately, the Ash family has banded together and forged a squad of German cavalry. Raz even told me the real problem is cracking how to get war horses. Alma told the king he wanted war horses from the Alva people, or even to hire their mercenary. The king wants to pull in everyone he's contacted and finally get answers from them. Inese claimed their ancestor horse riders once ruled the besieged land. They even used to have this weird childhood habit, slamming a block against their nose. Aints told everyone to chill and stop poking their noses. Sometimes they even swap goods with the Alva people for wool. Because they're tucked away behind the mountains, Alma fired off Rosewood as her envoy with trade goods. Wheat. The trade kept swelling, the profits. To lock their alliance in, Almas decided to ride straight into the Exuse tribe himself. Yuria drank in the breathtaking view, then snapped at Almas not to lean over the edge, because one slip would be disastrous. Then at last the extra party came into view in the distance, banners snapping in the wind like Almas and Yuria met Museo, the Exuse tribe chief's cheerful second. Museo's laid-back vibe showed in every handshake and playful back pat. And when while they rode on, Museo clocked Yuria's horse command and Alma's weird little Alma's decided they'd win more with generosity than with secrecy. If anyone was going to copy, they'd do it in the open. Museo's talk spiraled into farming, and Yuria kept insisting Almas's knowledge could help, while Museo practically begged, "Teach me." Almas laid it out in one clean punchline. Crops grow strong on At first, the soil feels fine, but little by little it gets drained. Almas laid it out. Those shrinking Museo hesitated at the thought of losing the land for a while, but Almas leaned in and promised him there were ways to bring it back. Museo burst into a laugh, thrilled by how sharp Almas really was. Every bit of it gave him even more fuel to pursue. Even with his doubts, the chief wasn't some monster. He wasn't out for war, and he wasn't against farming or... When the sun dipped and the mountains glowed, they crossed and set up camp right away. Museo barked orders, and suddenly urgent news crashed in. Someone had spotted a rampaging dragon nearby, and panic spread in seconds. Museo snapped at the scout for missing it like it was nothing, and Almas stepped up and offered to guide the envoy to safety. A dragon lunged out of the shadows, each crushing step thudding like war drums, and when Almas tightened his gaze, he knew tonight's peace just got ripped apart. Museo flicked a look at Almas, and right then they both felt the same weight of what could happen. So the plan snapped into focus. Gliding in silence, Almas clocked the beast's rhythm, slow, sure, but sharp as a blade, not dumb for a second. With adrenaline surging, Almas yelled to draw the beast in, and Museo roared beside him, lifting his axe high as hooves crashed and the whole world shrank to a blur. The dragon snapped forward with terrifying certainty, proving it wanted Almas. No questions asked. Almas shot a quick reassurance to the others, then rode out into the open by himself, sword flashing as he cut the dragon's snout. The dragon jerked and snapped like it was possessed, slamming its massive weight through earth and stone, and Museo hurled himself. He clocked its moves. Same pattern, same weakness, always leaning left. Almas tweaked his plan. Agony ripped through the beast as it screamed, blood spraying while it thrashed. The team snapped back. Suddenly, the dragon shot into the air, blazing with rage. Then it slammed down hard. Air screamed past Almas as he lunged forward. With shaky breath, Almas rammed his sword in one final thrust, right through the dragon's chest. They pushed through the battlefield as blood splattered everywhere and life drained away. Yuria rushed over and greeted them with bright warmth, but her breath caught at the sight of blood. Then Almas waved off her pants. As the yurt rose, warm lights flickered to life. Almas sank beside the fire, wine in hand, muscles screaming but his soul finally at peace. Museo slid in with food and a grin as bright. Beneath flickering lantern light, Almas lifted his cup toward Museo. Museo leaned in with wide, curious eyes, desperate to uncover the truth. Almas talked about the wind spirit's blessing, some divine gift so rare even archers barely ever see it. While Museo leaned in, fascinated by them, with a flick of Almas' wrist, a memory snapped into place. Almas shot his hand out and demanded trust, not for politics but to keep them alive, and when Museo, half serious, Museo swirled his drink and asked Almas straight up if pillaging was allowed in war. Before Almas even set foot inside, whispers of royal trouble had already reached Almas, 3 wives, 1 crown, and a kingdom buzzing with suspicion. While they were chatting about strength, Almas clocked how fast everyone dodged the moment real magic got brought up. No panic. Yuria spoke softly like she wasn't sure the curse wasn't hiding at all. It sat right in front of everyone, wrapped in the same. The poison wasn't just cruel. It was ancestral. The ritual hit like lightning, yet it still made the skin crawl. Poison slithered out as if it remembered every breath, curling into the air, and it wasn't just thrown away. It was condemned. Dinner restarted, but the tension didn't vanish. It just sank deeper. The threats weren't whispered anymore. Talk turned to diplomacy, because Exuse didn't win with brute force. He fought with night dropped like a curtain, and Yuria invited Almas to stay like a secret wrapped in kindness. Her eyes stayed calm, soft, and strangely peaceful, the kind kingdoms don't usually allow. With the room falling still, the stars glowing up at that tense ceiling, Almas couldn't stop himself. He smiled. The dragon's body lay motionless, screaming about the chaos of last night, while Alma stood over it, poking the wounds and muttering what he could harvest. And beside him, Museo kept shining. This rare ore latched into the dragon's hide, snatched their attention, and its value was beyond measure. Museo broke down what it could do and tied it to a legendary sword, and Almas flashed a grin, pitching the idea of forging fresh weapons, and Museo nodded like, "Let's do." As the crew rode through golden grasslands, talk spun from tribal customs to cutthroat equestrian politics. They got there before noon, right as a stable sat beside that massive enclosure, and Almas stared in awe. The stable rang with hooves and snorts, and firecrackers cracked nearby as Almas stepped closer to the horses. As Almas closed in, the horse sniffed his hand and nuzzled deeper, and a grin snapped onto Alma's face. He was already picking the name in his head. "You'll do," he murmured. Museo let out a chuckle. "Nice pick, but it's more than The villagers warned them wolves were gathering near the settlement, but Almas's crew stayed cool. "Compared to dragons, wolves are nothing," he muttered, yet he still planned ahead. They swept the area in a tight circle. From a far-off ridge, bone-chilling howls rolled through the air, and the shadows flashed with glinting boom. Firecrackers shattered the silence, and the wolves scattered fast, but Alma still caught them for a split second. Scarred muzzles, unnatural teamwork. "These aren't normal wolves," he muttered. Yuria stood before the capital and calmly introduced herself. Inside the palace, King Exuse welcomed them with ice-calm formality, his royal pose locked in place while his eyes... King Exaz spoke with wary caution, clocking Demorger's brutal aggression and all the betrayal scars from before. Almas fired back with a bold alliance pitch. Mutual benefit, raw strength, shared metal and protection. Yuria stepped in and laid out how Demorger's forces were closing in on both their lands, and the king went silent, then admitted the king finally dropped his bombshell request. An engagement. If Almas married... Even stunned, Almas didn't crack. He held his composure and clocked the real game. The king wasn't just forging peace, he was planting a claim. King Exaz leaned in and made it crystal clear. This wasn't just some symbolic gesture. Almas nodded and stretched his hand out, one slow inch at a time. When the king seized it with a crushing grip, the whole air seemed... They didn't sign a single paper or unroll any scroll, just locked eyes and sealed it with a... And just like that, when the sun slid behind far-off mountains, the palace gates loomed as Rhaegar stormed in. Jaw clenched, muscles tight, face blazing red as he snapped he needed to see Bernard. His fury hitting... Chaos already exploded inside, and Rhaegar caught sight of his brother in the chaos. Jock's fists were clenched, rage pouring as he shoved through the scrambling crowd, ignoring the He slammed his brother into the wall and snarled for the truth behind their mother's sudden illness, and even panic ripped through Rhaegar as his brother squirmed, sputtered excuses, and slipped away. But something darker kept turning in his gut, doubt. Was this... With grim urgency, Rhaegar started pulling at the threads of political power. Because Bernard's cowardice wasn't just guilt, it was fear. By morning, Earl slipped into the records chamber like a ghost, darting past guards and rotting scrolls. And when he dug, names spilled into the open. Nobles who swore loyalty were suddenly exposed as schemers. Earl handed... The plan snapped into place. Dora would personally grill every new candidate to make sure they'd stay loyal. Back in town, a clash was about to erupt. An agent from the Dory house planted himself in the paths. The agent yanked back, thrown off by Earl's real intentions, and the air shifted from threat to polite talk. Earl finally stumbled back to base camp. Round the dinner table, laughter finally loosened their worries. Right then his youngest daughter yanked his sleeve, and Earl froze. Later that night, Earl found himself beside Bernard again, and neither of them said a word as the stars glittered overhead. Sure, forgiveness still hadn't arrived, but something... Dawn slammed into the sky like a promise. The camp erupted into motion, and Earl gave Dora a sharp nod. Ready. The village finally started to buzz again. Fresh news about incoming changes ripped through the streets, and every curious gaze lit up with hope. A few leaders... Some people came with updates, others just stood there, silently listening, nodding. Every new arrival lit up a new question. Would they build, would they serve, or would they... Earl pitched, splitting the crew. Train the willing, pull in the skilled, and let the rest help with resettle. That morning's wind bit hard as they dashed the last rounds, grabbed every name they could, and exchanged quiet nods that said, "Yep, we're on board." Tomorrow, the new faces would start rolling in, and a whole month slid by like rain. Fields turned brighter, roofs got fixed, and the laughter sounded easier to breathe. Outside, a soft knock cut through the usual rhythm, and Yosef froze. Nobody showed up this early, and Earl stood there with a clipboard clutched in hand, shoulders locked from the trip. No warm. Turns out Earl dropped a name. Sarah. said she'd shown interest, and Yosef only sort of remembered it while her father spoke for her in all that stiff no. At the manor, Rhaegar stormed back and forth, furious like the walls were closing in. Rumors raced ahead of the messengers, and now he felt trapped. He snapped for his aides and demanded answers. Names flew, reports piled up, whispers of fresh plans and split loyalties hit him like a punch. If people bilayed now, the whole behind that frown, Rhaegar was doing the math in his head, mapping moves, calling contacts, sliding in bribes. Yet every play landed. Later, deep in the mansion's quiet corners, older voices hissed about his choices. Elsewhere, whispers and calm talks carried the day, no screaming needed at all. Joseph slipped back, and real progress didn't just show up in fields or houses. It hit the way. Even so, the scars still wouldn't disappear, and old pain surfaced without a fight. Joseph stared at what came next, because every choice felt like a tripwire. Push too hard, and they'd shatter what they... Rumors kept snapping back to Rhaegar. His once unbreakable plan snapped into place with one last shove. No brute force, just perfect timing. Those whispers, Joseph smiled. Everyone nodded, eyes locked in, and the next name on the list was Bernard. No brawl, no... They burst in with urgent news, and his voice dropped to a cautious whisper. Someone had spotted a... Rhaegar snapped into tension. Every instinct begged. 3 days stretched tight with tension. Messages ricocheted across borders. Names got swapped in. Bernhard's estate filled with strange footsteps. Someone had shown up, dust on his boots and diplomacy on his tongue. Earl set his message down with surgical care. No open threat. Bernhard forced a calm smile as he nodded at the gifts. Polite on the surface, but tight with nerves under. He turned down the offer in public with a steady voice. But Earl's mission wasn't built to end with applause. Someone was already deciding to switch sides. News ripped through the house faster than anyone expected. Then a few servants vanished, and the rest just froze and adjusted. Rhaegar tore through the news with pure fury, because that betrayal cut deeper than he'd ever admit aloud. His orders snapped like a whip. Spy, watch, intervene. While the allies rethought their next move, Rhaegar stayed pinned on the balcony, muscles tight. He'd built too much to watch it crumble. But every old age started sneaking into Bernhard's thoughts, quietly but cruelly. Then it hit him. Retirement wasn't just walking away, it was surrendering, and Rhaegar wasn't about to lose enough. Rhaegar barked out one last plea, his voice shredded with desperation. But Bernhard didn't. Illness crept in like whispers, and Bernhard lay still, breath shallow, yet strangely at peace. All those years, weight slipped off him, traded for quiet. De Morgan's army surged into Ash territory, smashing through a fragile power map forged by shifting. The Eaters panicked and called an emergency meeting. Then they almost stepped up without hesitation, ready to defend Ash territory with everything he had and drive his people straight to victory. Yulia steadied Almes with a warm hand, and even though she couldn't step in, she stayed in the tense hall like a calm heartbeat. Almes put the capital in Yulia's hands, the very place he swore to guard. Almes got the word. Damorger's army was packing around 25,000 soldiers. Ash's forces barely add up to 13,000. And even with the odds stacked against him and political backstabs hitting left, the army barreled toward Fort Talia, a freshly renovated fortress that just became the key piece. Almes ordered his troops to stand down, then gathered the... Almes burst back home, and Tetra and he faced the truth. There was basically no chance at all against 25,000 soldiers. They're going to choke off the enemy's supplies and use Damorger's ugly feud with his neighbors as the perfect weapon. Tetra lit a fire under Almes, telling him she believed he'd win and giving him the courage he needed before the battle even started. A frantic message burst in. Enemy soldiers were spotted close by, and Almes had to move right now. Almes and Tetra stared at the massive Damorger army gearing up to invade, and the terrifying threat hit them like a 7-day battle is about to explode. Thanks to Tetra's confident advice, Almes is handed the reins as the true commander. De Morgan's army marches in without stopping, closing the distance as the tension snaps tighter and the showdown finally ignites. Tenino, a Damorger officer, fires up Carlo, the commander and Damorger's first prince, by talking straight about their battle confidence. Tenino steps up and calls himself General, watching Carlo's command and the army's readiness with a calm, intense focus. Tenino rips into Carlos's talent, but he still gives credit where it's due. Carlos can delegate like a pro and own the results. Tenino is convinced they can conquer Adelnia. If everyone gangs up and follows, Carlo spills their plan, take Ash's territory first, then push for peace. so they dodge a full-blown Rose's War right. The Demorger army surges toward Fort Telia, laying siege tactics in place and setting up a crushing encirclement the moment they arrive. Intel says Fort Telia's defenses are split into 3 blazing stronghold zones, each packed with 8,000 soldiers. Commanders slam their troops toward the fort's northern gate, leaving the southern side barely guarded. Tonino slams the alarm. Supplies are running out, and they've got to lock down the supply route right now. Ditch the fort and you hand the enemy a pincer attack. So you'd better lock down every escape route, or you're not surviving. Tonino pitches the brutal idea of unleashing slave soldiers first, just to carefully gauge how hard the enemy can really. From Fort Telia's western tower, Olmus and Ron lock eyes as the enemy's first wave charges in. The enemy hauls logs and timber like it's a war chant in motion, clearly setting up to fill the moat and smash. Olmus snarls at the archers to loose a thunderous volley of arrows right at the enemy surge. Arrows streak through the air, but the enemy laughs them off, hiding behind logs like they're made of steel. Even without armor, the enemy is still oddly protected. Those arrows hit, but the impact doesn't bite as hard. Olmus studies the enemy's playbook. When they ditch their armor to sprint, they slam logs into place as shields and grab them as tools, all to keep moving faster. The enemy bolts for the moat, weaving past a storm of arrows as Olmus barks for the defenders to keep firing. Olmus spots a few enemies leaping straight into the moat, and it screams pure desperation. The enemies lash logs together beneath the water, building a bridge across the moat right in front of them. Olmus stares in pure disbelief as the enemy tries to scale the fort using a wobbling ladder that's barely holding on. Olmus fires off a razor-aimed shot. Enemies who don't have weapons can't fight after crawling through all that danger, or the defenders with losses crashing down on them. The enemy scrambles backward in a panic, jerking away from the assault and crawling back to their own lines. Even while they pull back, the defenders are still arguing. Do they keep battering the enemy? Tonino learned that a few slave soldiers had escaped the slaughter and come back. Tonino orders the returned slaves, and their families, to be executed, and he punishes betrayal with cold. Archers seize the slaves and cut them down fast, and that blood-soaked speed scream. Tonino blares out the next wave, cheering like crazy because the bridge they built now lets the salt flood. Suddenly, boom, the bridge detonates, rattling Damorger's army and tearing apart their carefully planned. Commanders huddle over the explosive device, their voices sharp as they wonder if this brutal setback spells the end. Tonino admits the setback, but he slams the brakes on doubt, promising the next assault is still on, even after they lost ground on fort. Siege towers spring up as the ready Damorger army tightens its ranks, bracing to unleash a full assault right. A sharp breakdown lays out fort. From the central tower, the defenders watched the enemy slave soldiers pull back, and they knew they'd held the line. Olmus and Tetra rushed to check the towers for cracks, and they confirmed. The defenders suddenly see siege towers rolling in, and they know the real enemy army. The enemy hoists their shields and builds ramps. Shields locked together and covers surged forward, hauling the soldiers straight up to the fort. Defenders unleash a storm of arrows, pinning the enemy infantry and desperately trying to halt their deadly march forward. Archers line up across the moat, roaring orders to the infantry. Ignore those towers and smash back with everything on the attacks. The siege tower rumbled toward Telia, packed with enemy soldiers itching to smash through the fortress walls. Archers cranked up inside the towers and opened fire, right as the defenders were caught off guard, so they scrambled for cover as the arrows came flying in. The defenders grabbed their braces as enemy soldiers surged forward with shields, charging straight for the fort's walls. Olmus drops the bombshell. He's unleashing brand new catapults to launch a brutal counterattack. The catapult latches in, slings its payload, and blasts open a fresh, brutal chapter in the fort's defense. The catapult rips into action, hurling a colossal projectile straight at the siege tower to smash the enemy's. The tower erupts with a violent blast, screaming proof. Even after the blast, the tower still stands, fully intact. Its hidden reinforcements. As the defenders study the fort's defenses, they realize these towers are packed with soaked leather and sharpened metal, all stitched together by magic to shrug off explosions. A siege tower barrels forward, and the defenders clamp down hard. Archers inside the walls are already lining up to unleash a storm. The defenders snap to attention. Those armored enemy soldiers aren't. Tetra locks onto the enemy commander and snaps orders to her troops, sinking the assault with razor-sharp precision artillery. Archers raise their bows and line up their shots on the commander, ready to shatter the enemy's chain of command. The defenders fired their shot, praying it would snap the enemy's command and drain the assault. Siege towers roar toward Fortella's walls, inching forward no matter how. A chaotic battle explodes. Enemy soldiers scramble up the tower, gearing up for brutal hand-to-hand combat. Defender Ron charges onto the siege tower and fights like a storm, smashing through enemy soldiers on the platform and driving them back. Enemy archers snarl and loose blazing arrows, trying to rip the defender's grip off the tower's edge. Ron rockets across the tower, smashing enemies back and keeping total control so no breaches ever crack the wall. Ron barks orders to the defenders. Guard the narrow path with your life, because he's determined to stop anyone from slipping through. Arrows screamed through the air as Ron steeled himself, bracing for every incoming shot while he stayed razor alert in the chaos of the battlefield. Captain Ron snaps back to focus and locks into fight beside Yosef, ready to stop that siege tower in its tracks. Yosef rockets into the fight, holding the line like his life depends on it. Their fight blows the defenders' minds, and as they stand shoulder to shoulder repelling enemy assaults, people are already calling Ron and Yosef the deadliest swordsmen alive, convinced nothing. Meanwhile, the other soldiers lose their nerve as enemy siege towers slam into the walls. Gearing up to smash, the enemy force surges forward like a battering ram, smashing through shield walls and driving brutal straight-in assaults. Commanders bark orders. Defenders lock in and build a tight wall, while archers ring the front and rain arrows on the enemy's close. Defenders fight for their lives as the enemy smashes through the wall, hurling ladders and siege weapons again and again. Alarm bells scream as the boats roll in beneath the wall, and you just know the enemy has switched tack. The enemy rides in on boats, turning them into floating platforms, then builds solid footholds to climb straight up the fort's walls. Defenders stagger as the enemy's plan clicks into place. Coordinated ladder raids slam in while chaos erupts and commanders keep drinking. An enemy soldier gets blasted off his feet, but the defenders fear commanders huddle and tear apart the enemy's plan. Then they spot the truth. The East almost rolls out a brand new, brutal siege weapon, and the whole operation kicks off to crush the commanders. Fire the signal, aiming for a synchronized blast that hits all at once, blasting fear straight into. The new weapon blasts out with unstoppable fury, catching the defenders off guard as its power wipes them. A cannonball detonates into the siege towers, ripping them apart in brutal explosions and throwing the enemy's whole advance into chaos. Massive flames roar along the walls, and the attackers below spiral into chaos and pure panic. The defenders steel themselves to crank up their next assault, targeting the enemy's. The commander snaps an order to torch the siege towers, and the siege tower erupts in flames as fire and oil cut through the defense. Even as the defender stares at the burning siege tower and realizes the oil is the real weapon. Tetra bursts in, and boom. She reveals she's a mage sent as reinforcements to smash in and help. Tetra fires a blazing magical fireball, launching a brutal counterattack and shouting just. The soldiers flinch at Tetra's magic, blinking like they've just seen a curse, and think. Tetra breaks down how the fire cannon works. Its magic gears lighting up a mix of black. The weapon gulps massive fuel, and if that fire magic circle ever stops, it'll blow up in a heartbeat. The fire cannon blasts the enemy's siege tower into flames, tearing their momentum apart and smashing their defense. Soldiers threw a victory party after surviving the first battle day, their spirits soaring because reinforcements hit, and as night blankets the battlefield, the enemy camp. After the siege, the wounded fight back hard. Some even hurl themselves into the moat just to stay alive. Enemy generals huddle and trade grim looks as the fire cannon's blast shatters morale, and the battle's brutality leaves. During the strategy talk, they realize fortress is surrounded, but the defender almost snatches the report showing the wounded and the deceased, and the true price of this defense hits him hard. Ron grins with confidence, pointing out that their army's taking fewer losses, and they've got the upper hand overall. Commanders cracked open the booze, handing out alcohol to the soldiers. Burroughs loudly praises Tetra and the soldiers for their. The leaders huddle and argue, stay sharp or finally rest, and the night slips in so quietly, until a blaring alarm erupts and announces an unexpected enemy strike on the fortress. Ron and the crew brace for the incoming enemies, counting bodies as they squint through the chaos, but the view keeps. Night attackers slip through the dark, advancing with no torches and no noise, so the fortress defenders get blindsided. Leaders clock the attackers' plan, hide their numbers in the dark and unleash chaos while night swallows the battle. Marching through the darkness is brutal, but the attackers press in to throw the defenders off balance. Suddenly, arrows scream out of hiding, and the defenders get blindsided, caught off guard by enemies they can't even see. Enemy soldiers cower under the broken siege ruins, clawing their way out of the fortress battlefield as defenders finally steady their nerves, staring into the chaos, wondering why that loud nightmare. The enemies try to grind the defenders down, flooding them with threats and non-stop harassment through the long watch. Commanders stare down the chaos, hunting for the moment defenders misstep. They split their forces, holding the line with fierce counterattacks while letting half the soldiers catch their breath. Even with the plan in place, non-stop harassment keeps the defenders up all night, ripping away any chance to finally get fresh off a good rest. The soldiers jolt awake at dawn, morale buzzed and ready to smash into. Commanders huddled over the siege plan, betting the fortress would crack within 2 weeks of non-stop pressure. On day 2, the army rallies behind Alma's ash with full confidence, ready to unleash their brutal assault again. Siege Day 2 kicks off at Tyria Fort, and the soldiers are getting crushed by exhaustion and drowned in non-stop battle noise. Ron, sick of every distraction and burning with exhaustion, clenches his resolve and vows to stay focused. While Ron battles off attackers, the defenders push to line up the flame cannon, banking on its blast to flip the whole battle. The flame cannon erupts, blasts the wooden siege tower into raging fire. Ron cheers as the siege tower erupts in flames. Meanwhile, the enemies he can't see are scrambling. The defenders' note-powered flame cannons can't be. Ron storms in and whips the troops into a frenzy, while the garrison stares in disbelief at the enemy's bazaar. Burroughs warns everyone to save their flame cannon ammo, because the enemies fire. The defenders are betting everything on Tetra's knowledge, using it to. Tetra steps up to break the siege tower's magical barrier, and right as she unleashes Dispel Magic, and the protective barrier guarding the enemy's tower starts buckling fast. Tetra launches a blazing magical shot, smashing the now unprotected siege tower with a gut-punching strike. The tower crumples in a huge, brutal collapse, catching both sides off. The defenders stare at the shock of the barrier disappearing, then demand Tetra take the lead and smash forward with the offensive. Enemy soldiers spot Tetra as the voodoo user and slam into a full sprint to snatch her during the. Tetra snaps into action and strikes back fast, mowing down her attackers with deadly skill and surprising her even with how good she is. Defenders shout for Tetra to fall back as the enemy tightens the trap, turning the siege up to full blast. Soldiers snapped into a tight defensive ring. Commanders huddle and rip into the danger magic brings to the front lines, making one thing crystal clear: the West Tower is under siege. Soldiers brace on the walls as enemies crash in, hauling up. Tetra and Ron huddled up and grilled each other about that weird little siege weapon that had just shown up. The new siege weapon rolls in as a mobile battering ram, totally different from those bulky tower defenses. They dug into how the enemy tactics had changed, scratching their heads at the sudden swap away from siege towers. The enemy shoves the battering ram ahead, gearing up to slam through the fort's defenses in a bit. As the towers fall, the enemies hurl debris into the moat, piling it up until it becomes a rough bridge. Once that rubble bridge holds, the defenders' hearts sink. The fire bursts into the ram, but its defenses overpower the siege towers, leaving the defenders stunned. The ram's slanted roof tipped just right, and arrows bounced off. Commanders order a strike on the soldiers hammering the bridge, but the voodoo users won't back them up. The enemy hauls debris from smashed siege towers and builds a rough. Lulu charges up to the front lines, volunteering to help with the plan to take down that battering ram. She braces to smash through the barrier guarding the battering ram, trading quick cues with. Ron snaps an explosive spear into place, eyes blazing as he prepares to strike the soldiers trying to cross the new debris bridge. Lulu snaps into action, chanting a spell as she clutches magic talismans. Lulu flings a devastating dispel spell straight at the enemy's makeshift bridge, striking the very ground it's. The blast rips the bridge apart, and debris plus pieces of the battering ram go crashing down in a chaotic rain. The defenders erupted in cheers after the battering ram got smashed, but every eye stayed locked on the chaos ahead, even with setbacks slamming him down. Ron steps up, takes command, and vows to defend the West Tower as he braces. Ron rallies the defenders at the central tower, gearing up for a brutal count. A Hawk messenger swoops in, screaming the update. Phase 1 of their plan just landed perfectly. The Damorger military camp sprawled across the valley, bracing for a decisive battle that was about to crash in fast. Tonino shoots back with total confidence. His siege tactics worked. Carlo sees Tonino's progress and grins, certain they'll win, because they're about to seize the western tower. Suddenly, Tonino lets out an ominous laugh, and his subordinate panics, warning Carlo that something worrying has just... It revealed that Dora's village on their supply route had fallen, and panic ripped through every... Tonino learns a bombshell. 3,000 Ross's cavalry have been unexpectedly captured, while even with the only road between kingdoms under their watch, they still can't figure out how that massive army slipped. They brainstorm other routes, but the mountain range is a dead end. So Carlo remembers a wild rumor about Alma's Ash, Griffin's supposed son, said to be the one stirring up the enemy cavalry. Tonino admits his patrols were too weak, and the pressure spikes fast as they scramble to stop a surprise. In their war tent, the generals and nobles huddled in panic, while the army... Carlo blurted that Dora's village had been wiped out, sealing the fate of... Several nobles snapped in rage, swore they wouldn't retreat, and blamed Baraus for treating the... Barras leaned in and said their whole family was riding on how the war turned. Even with the tension roaring, Carlo stayed cool and reminded them. If they retreated, it would all... Tonino nods at Barros, refuses to fall back, and sets the plan in motion. He'll send his troops to storm Dori. Carlo tells Damorger that the enemy's strength is barely a slice of their land, and that means, even with nerves on full blast, the nobles finally agree. Carlo lays into Burros with praise, then hands him the commander role to smash back and retake Dora's village. With 5,000 soldiers at his back, Beerus grabs command and vows to tear through and reclaim. The army pushes into the deadly Griffin's forest, racing to get out before nightfall so no ambush claws them in the dark. Soldiers burst through the forest with panic in their hearts. Worried sick, the group can't stop gushing over the legendary Rosa's cavalry. Alma's cavalry is untamed and razor-sharp. Brutal, skilled. Raymond admits this is his first time leading, and then he laughs, like, I'm really gonna hand command to the... As night creeps in, the troops hunt for a hidden camp spot where they can sleep tight. No fires, no light, no mistakes. At the crack of dawn, the army gears up to smash a tiny border village, then halts to rest the horses before the assault. Soldiers slam through the village streets, crashing in with a lightning raid that catches the enemy completely off guard. Civilians scream and scatter as Damorger soldiers slam into the village, tearing through the defenses fast and ending any resistance. The village chief's world shatters when he learns, stunned to his core, that Rosa's soldiers just crushed the Damorger forces. The villagers drop their weapons, beg for mercy, and promise to raise the Rosa's flag. No more fighting. Damorger's soldiers don't torch the village, because Dora's people had already been stripped of supplies. Carlo drops to his knees before the village chief, begging for his help and a quiet, peaceful surrender to their cause. Rosa's cavalry storms village after village, forcing surrender and hoisting flags before rolling right on to the next. In Dora's village, the captured chief hurls the news at the Damorger soldiers. Someone just offered them surrender. The village defenders finally get the brutal truth. Their infantry can't stand up to the enemy cavalry's sheer force, and that realization, they slammed the gates shut and scrambled into place, ready to smash the incoming enemy cavalry before it got any closer. Rosa's cavalry bursts onto the scene, charging straight for the village with tightly coordinated mounted archers who fire and ride. Defenders scrambled, but those mounted archers kept firing laser-precise shots from horseback. More cavalry charges in, and the defenders buckle under the crushing pressure, panicking because they can't hit moving targets. Rosa's cavalry blankets the fortress from every side, numbers crushing in on them as they ready a perfectly timed arrow storm. Raymond stares down the nightmare of being boxed in, but he's certain surrender is only a matter of time. Soldiers muscle a ballista right up to the fortress walls, and they're ready to smash into the defenders. The ballista operators slap together ready black powder ammo. Raymond barks an order, ballista fire, and the Rosa's cavalry's debut battle ignites on the spot. The ballista blasts the fortress gate to pieces, shattering the wood into splinters and ripping open a massive breach in an instant. Defenders lose their nerve as the gate crumples, terrified the enemy will barrel in instantly. Rossy's cavalry charged through the shattered gate, roaring as they raced. Fierce fighting explodes as both armies crash together. Horsemen thunder in, and the defenders fight back with desperate, relentless count. Rosy soldiers sprint deeper in, tearing the fortress apart as the invaders smash through, and chaos. The captain charges straight at the invaders, gripping hope in his fists, and won't let them push past the gate. Raymond barrels in with threats, and the captain finally caves, surrendering as the weapons get tossed aside, one by one with clear reluctance. Raymond throws down a promise of mercy. If they drop their weapons, he'll spare them. Using that kindness, he lays it out plainly. They'll leave non-combatants alone, spare anyone who throws down, and push hope hard, because the defenders grimly give up. But Rose's troops swear they'll punish only the ones who truly lit this war. Rosie's army stormed into Dora's village, then zeroed in on the very last grain. Captain Raymond snapped orders to Virgil to torch the grain store. Flames swallowed the wooden granaries, black smoke cloying into the sky while the soldiers stayed oddly calm as it all burned down in front of them. Roswald snapped over wasting food, but Raymond shoved that aside. He chose speed and survival, even if it meant leaving the marching army. Meanwhile, in Garnet Mine City, Rune couldn't stop wishing he were off. Rune barked that he had to stay back, seething because he wanted to unleash his lightspeed slash on Almies. A panicked messenger burst in shouting that Rosy's army had seized Dor's village and was already marching out with 3,000 soldiers. Rune smirked and shrugged it off, convinced his father's message proved Rose's forces were trapped inside Tyria. Sensing the danger, Rune pictured crushing Ross's army and proving, once and for all, that his feeling unstoppable behind the citadel. Rune braced to hold the line tight while he shouted for reinforcement. Rose's cavalry thundered into action before Browse City, crashing into the defenders with a sudden, perfectly coordinated. Rose's slammed down the demand. Browse City had to surrender, then dropped the terrifying truth that Rune clocked it. Rose's was stacking alliances and rolling out superior cavalry, and they showed up for the assault wave. With the truth in hand, Rune found under 100 soldiers. So defense was. Browse City finally crumbled without a fight, throwing open its gates for Ross's. Rosy soldiers rolled into Browse City, stunned by its garnet riches after a surrender. The troops partied hard when they cracked open the captured city and hauled out spices, gold, and glittering glass. Virgil gave thanks for serving Roswald, his heart locked onto freedom, while they mapped out villages, pinned down who led them, and counted the taxes like gold. Because it was those numbers. Realizing Rune ran the whole operation, Roses seized the moment and dragged him into chains as a political. Rune outright refused to become a hostage, flexing that he was famous among the Browse citizens. Rhea pressed the safety of his family like a blade to Rune's throat, and Rune had no choice but to grudgingly agree to go with them. That night, Rose's forces dug in around Browse City, bracing for a brutal. Amos's allies heard Rose crush the fight, and next morning Browse slammed his forces toward Dora's village, only to learn the commander jolted with panic as Raysiz's army bore down. He yanked every troop toward Browse City and ditched the original plan. News hit the Damorger army at Tyria Fortress like a punch. Browse City was gone, swallowed by the fall. That brutal loss shattered everything, so the Damorger commanders slammed into an urgent strategy, meeting to rip apart their debate erupted. Some yelled to fall back, others urged reinforcements and tighter defense. Carlos calmly ordered a retreat, catching the Damorger commanders off guard with his ruthless, strategic decision. He said regrouping would slam the brakes on the worst losses, and the council, grudging as hell, started preparing to pull their forces back. Another commander slammed his fist over the retreat, panicking that it would trash his reputation, and orders ripped through the ranks, bring the scattered troops back together, and send for reinforcements from the kingdom's capital. Carlos strapped on armor for the talks, while Tolnino swore he'd guard the army's exposed. Tolnino stepped up to guard the retreat, because he still remembered how Almas had crushed him near Tyria Fortress. Tolnino swore he'd escort Carlo to safety during the retreat operation. The scouts counted 8,000 enemies, and with their tiny force and attack, Tolnino's flank guard stepped up, ready to die, buying the main army just enough time to slip away. Soldiers huddled behind their shields as enemy bombs tore through the sky, and they launched a desperate defensive. Explosions ripped through the battlefield, blasting soldiers away as enemy bombardment smashed their defenses to pieces. Terrified troops understood they had nothing left to do but pray as the deadly bombardments tore toward them. Tolnino snapped at scattered soldiers to rally together, as enemy cavalry thundered straight for their position. Almost charged at the front, launching himself into the assault with iron resolve. De Morgan's formation crumpled instantly. Soldiers who'd been following Tonino's plan couldn't stand up to the sheer. De Morgan's flank guard got crushed, tumbling back from Tyria Fortress as morale died, and their formation collapsed for good. At Tyria Fortress, the scouts watched Damorger's army haul. Ulma's plan worked. When the enemy yanked back, it cracked their supply. Commanders cracked down on the offensive plans, shouting, "Move smart." Troops braced themselves. Every bit. He almost signed over the command, then snapped that choice in half and charged to the front lines with Sakura, right beside his trusted horse. Before the battle, Almas pumped himself up, tending to his horse, rallying. Their army lined up, bold and certain, staring down the enemy with nothing up their sleeve. Commanders ordered black powder onto the ballistae, aiming to tear the enemy. As the formation shattered, Ron surged his soldiers ahead, shouting for everyone to keep close. Panic burst across Damorger's flank. Some soldiers bolted, while the leaders scrambled to hold the defense. Talino barked for a tactical retreat, snapping the right wing into a tight formation by the forest so they could defend like a wall. The flank army braced for a brutal sacrifice of the left wing. On the third day, Almas finally barreled into a border village and found the enemy survivors already waiting there. Almost, he ordered Bartholomew to lock down the village, watching how it was starving for supplies and offering barely any defenses. Just as the soldiers surged forward, enemy archers snapped loose a brutal arrow volley, and the Almas snapped at Ron to lead the charge, hunting for a way to Inside the village, unarmed civilians threw themselves to their knees, begging for mercy. Almas rallied a search party, bandaged up the wounded, and pushed after the attackers who were hitting them with sudden. Till Nino's crew called a halt and camped for the night, locking down their position before pushing on. The construction crew's stash of supplies, and even their arrows, were hauled in so they'd have everything they needed to hold out through the night until Nino had wooden barricades set up for aerial defense, but they wouldn't stand a chance against black powder weapons. Intel cracked open the truth. Enemy forces were trapped behind barricades in the second village. He was about to scrap the night assault, so he camped through the darkness instead, waiting for daylight to stop more losses. Tonino's forces rolled into Doris village without a scratch, thanks to careful planning and tight retreat coordination. On the fourth day, Tolnino sprinted back into the main De Morger army, and they greeted him with sheer relief. Tolnino came back alive, but it cost them dearly, so he pounded the point. He snapped to it and demanded a situation report from his officers. Just to pin, reports came in showing their defenses smashed, their supplies burned, and their rank. Browse slipped back into the city without answering a single order, and the whole place snapped with worry and confusion. Tolnino got urgent word that King De Morger had finally. Tolnino got the order to stand down for 3 brutal days, even as everyone feared their strength would run out before the clock did. He sized up the enemy and decided they wouldn't dare strike head-on, so he held his ground and waited. Both sides froze in uncertainty, praying their reinforcements would burst through the door. Alma leapt in to praise Sakura the horse for powering. Burrows plotted to seize Dora's village, but Almi shot it down, insisting they wait until the army came roaring back in full force. Almas let the troops finally drop their gear, throw a celebration, and recharge their. In Browse City, Raymond squared up to Rune and used his family like a. Rune wouldn't fold, so Raymond snapped into action, gearing up for a fast, no-holds-barred fight to get the. Raymond gathered his soldiers and barked orders to get ready for a brutal fight against the opposing general. Right before the engagement kicked off, enemy cavalry thundered in out of nowhere, and Browse snapped his cavalry forward and moved to cut off the enemy, betting they'd clash head-on in a mounted showdown. Mutio snapped into the frontal clash with total confidence, ready to tear down Browse's rushing horsemen the moment the Mutio unveiled that his cavalry weren't just fighters. They were razor-precise archers, turbocharged by a wind spirit's blessing. Browse's formation shattered the moment his archers loosed their volleys, mowing down the charging. Mutio faked a retreat, yanked his troops back, and planted a deadly trap for Browse as he charged in. Then Browse ordered a full retreat, so their formation wouldn't snap under the enemy's relentless pressure. As the army fell back, enemy cavalry jeered at them and sparks flew into brutal skirmishes, until every insult turned into a heated, personal fight. Believing the enemy archers were easy prey, Browse drove his cavalry forward, determined. Mutio saw their attack coming. He knew once they got close, they'd chase him straight into the trap, no matter what they realized. And as the enemy surged in, Mutio snapped a signal, launching a brutal counterattack and tightening the trap around them. Browse's forces only realized the trap at the last second. Enemy cavalry had boxed them in on every side. A fresh enemy army surged in from the side, squeezing the trap tighter and sealing every escape. 3 battle zones were already set, armies sitting in perfect position, waiting with sharp nerves for the other side to make the first. At the captain's command, Vilger's squad slammed to a stop, shielding Museo. Up on the high ground, the soldiers watched the enemy cavalry crumple when Raymond's plan shattered their troops. Sized up the Rosas Kingdom cavalry's threat, tightened their defenses, and stayed locked. A flare rocketed into the sky, and that signal snapped Rosewold's squad. Rosewold tore ahead, leading the cavalry straight into the charge, his soldiers roaring as defenders scrambled to clamp down and guard those vulnerable. Vilger surged forward like a blade, mowing down the soldiers in his way, roaring orders as he demanded Rhea press on. Rhea and Vilger moved like a perfect storm, slicing down the enemy soldiers in sync while Rosewold watched from the side. Rhea ripped her weapon through the air from her saddle. Then Rosewold's squad stayed right on their heels. Cavalry and infantry slammed into the mess of enemies. Cavalry thundered straight into the shielded infantry, and everything exploded into chaos as soldiers dug in and fought through the enemy lines. Crumbled under the assault. Horses smashed through. A sudden lurch, then the horse crashed down and rolled, and the soldiers lost their nerve, screaming as the whole charge crumpled. Raz's army went totally haywire. Bodies and horses blasted through. Rosewold studied the battlefield with cold focus, clocking their enemies' inexperience as his own troops pressed forward with razor-sharp discipline. Rose's foes went into full panic as their lines broke and Rose's soldiers scattered, and Rhea and the cavalry surged forward, and Browse's army watched its formation shatter. Panic hit as he realized his hulking, heavily armored troops were boxed in, then torn apart by enemy infantry. Bolted in terror as the cavalry crashed through, and Browse seethed at the cowardice they showed. Rage burned in his chest as he tore forward alone, desperate to fight even as his army crumbled around him. A brutal knight slammed into their push, and Rosewall barked. Browse showed up and went straight for Rosewall, daring him to. Rosewold crashed head-on into Browse, and the moment with a razor-sharp strike, Rosewold unseated Browse, and the general went flying, crashing hard on. Browse clawed his way to his feet, staving off Rosewold's spear, while Rosewold barked that he'd pay for any reckless move. On the 4th morning they called it victory, and Bruce plus his son were seized alive. Raymond's cold detachment snapped back into place, and the moment it did, the soldiers erupted, cheering wildly as the commander marched his. Raymond swallowed his pride, thanked Rosewold and Museo, and then his son lit up, praising him with real, heartfelt words for pulling it off. Olmaz ripped through the captured loot, then watched the prisoners nod, confirming the entire Browse family was. Even after they caught him, he kept his chin up, defiant as ever, swearing that his brother and son would one day. Olmaz braced for the last showdown, sizing up his enemy's true strength while his remaining family stood under his control. In the Domorger camp, desertions surged as Almaz forces sharpened their. Tolanino got dragged into a strategy meeting, and the moment they saw their crumbling, he replayed those past retreats in his mind. In the War Council, Carlo strode up to the commanders gathered for the next huge. Carlo's faction huddled inside, and when Tolanino slipped in with them, he knew their political squabbles could shatter their unity before the enemy. Reports poured in. 15,000 soldiers were still standing their ground against 13,000 enemy troops, and the fight felt. The commander stormed into the room and demanded battle strategies to crush Rossi's charging. Silence hung in the air as everyone finally got it. Hope alone couldn't replace a real, solid plan to win. With losses piling up fast, Carlo finally broke, ready to surrender, because he was terrified the council finally caved, because there was no strategy left to stop Rossi's overwhelming advantage and relentless push. Domorger's army shot a messenger into the fray. On the 4th night near Doris village, Rossi's men huddled inside his occupied territory, readying. Olmaz hardened his resolve to back his side to the very end, because he knew his opponent. Carlo stormed into the negotiation tent and bowed with respect as Olmaz waited across the table. Both leaders traded stiff, formal words, each one admitting they had to stamp out the tension between their kingdoms. Carlo offered a 1-year truce, betting it would buy the South some breathing room while still. Olmaz agreed, and the truth hit hard. Dragging this war out only got them nowhere unless Carlo then slammed down the verdict. The Browse territory goes, fully and complete. Olmaz stared at Carlo's offer in shock, then quickly understood the brutal truth. Guarding territory like that, he narrowed the claim to Western Browse and demanded top-tier blacksmiths, not piles of extra land. Carlo nodded in agreement, because he knew knowledge and manpower beat a territory too wild to control. Alma proposed a brutal ransom plan. Grab the Browse family and trade their freedom for cold, hard coin, making both kingdoms richer. Almas finally demanded Carlo stay inside his kingdom until they sealed a proper agreement. Almas delivered his proposal with full confidence, stunning Carlo by laying out his strategy. Carlos admitted Alma's sharp cunning, and Almas quietly bowed to his role as a future king. As soon as the meeting wrapped up, Almas' allies threw their hands in the air, cheering the truce like a massive heart. Swore he'd seize the throne and claim Uria, putting his family's safety above everything else. His dream wasn't just power. It was guarding his allies and the orphans, forging everyone into one force that would kneel under his rule. Carlo braced himself for a brutal civil war, one where every Deeble's faction could be crushed, but the price would wreck the kingdom and practically beg an invasion. To win, he almost had to gamble everything, crush the enemy while sparing lives, so the battered kingdom wouldn't get picked. Damorger's defeat handed Almes the perfect excuse, and the power to strike first. Rasissa's forces snapped back home at once, gearing up for the internal clash brewing against Abe. After days of relentless marching, the troops finally stumbled back into Ash territory. Even though exhaustion crushed them, the leader snapped for speed, because the mission still screamed for. He loaded 1,000 soldiers onto the settlement's walls, locking it down tight. So after meeting Musio, the general leaned in and weighed the real question: go home now or stay and risk one more day? The general teased a secret, daring everyone to stick around, because something serious. The army slammed through Ash territory without stopping, and by the very next day, they finally rolled into Rose's capital. Crowds packed the streets, roaring so hard that it blew past the celebrations they threw. Alma's win against a tougher enemy exploded their fame, and sensing how much public support mattered, Alma's blasted his forces inside Ross's inner castle. Orders snapped out. Roles got assigned, and every move for the next. Alma's was met by officials who showered him with praise, hailing how he helped drive back. Even with his allies buzzing around him, his escort drove him to the king. He marched beside his comrades, swallowing sharp jabs about their political rivals as they pushed deeper into Rose's brutal stronghold. Right at the audience chamber doors, Almas strode in and declared his return. Inside the grand hall, Almas strode toward the throne while courtiers stood along. The companions leaned in, eyes locked on the king as the moment they were waiting for. The king showered Amos with praise for his victories, and that made Amos step. His bold demand blew the crowd away, and while everyone stared, the king blew past every expectation, handing Uria not just what she asked for. Overwhelmed with joy, Almas and Uria burst into the hall and threw their arms out. I'll sweep Uria into my arms and crush my lips to hers, sealing our union right under the crowd. Then he swore he'd never let her slip away again, and Uria said yes on the spot, no hesitation. With the crown gleaming on his head, Almas thrust the royal staff. Hand in hand with Uria, he strode ahead while the crowd roared, chanting for their brand new king. Almas snapped the celebration to a stop, roaring that the war wasn't over yet, and victory still. Almas ripped into the room with a bold decree. Still, enemies hid within the kingdom, and he ordered Prince Carlo to be dragged. Carlo finally arrived and started calling out the high-ranking nobles he believed were secretly helping. The list finally closed with one brutal verdict. Diable and the rest were hit with treason, all thanks to Carlos's. The shock hit the courtroom like lightning, and everyone scrambled with. Almas snapped that execution had to happen, and she ordered every identified. The guards lunged in and crushed the accused nobles. Resistance, yanking them into chaos detonated through the hall as soldiers slammed suspects to the ground, and Almas watched in silence from the throne. Almas stepped into the assembly and demanded answers, pressing everyone on their loyalty and digging for any. No one dared challenge him, so he slammed down his next move. Commanders shoved the reports in, and Almas immediately ordered his forces to wipe out the 9,000 enemy soldiers standing right there. Almas roared that he'd personally take command of the rest of the forces. Then he slammed his allies back into place, reaffirming the bonds with his trusted comrades so their support would stay locked in under his reign. They swore they'd fight side by side, because the war against their enemies still had. Almas replayed his choice in his mind, knowing it would come back to crush him later. Almas snapped his orders, splitting the army into 3 divisions. Soldiers burst into the building, barking at civilians to freeze in place while they swept. The king's command hit the air, and the troops slammed the doors shut. At Deeble's fort, refugees huddled in desperate fear, praying their leader would actually stand between them and disaster. Bartholomew rallied his soldiers, snapped that the barricaded fort's occupants were traitors, and screamed for an immediate assault. The Rose's army barreled toward Deeble Mansion in a lightning, perfectly coordinated surge, catching the defenders off guard immediately. Commander Ron's soldiers ringed the mansion, slammed shut every escape route. Alma's ordered it, so they played dumb and pretended to wait. While sealing inside, Rigger's fury boiled as he grilled Gilbert for choosing to gather. Regard unleashed on his former allies who chose Alma's, calling them cowards. Rigger snapped that their doom came from the vanished forces, then demanded Gilbert rally every last. Gilbert took the job on in front of everyone, but behind the scenes, he judged Rigger as a lost cause, doomed to fall, and urged that the advisor pushed for mercy to calm Alma's, but Gilbert snapped back. Meanwhile, Alma's main army surged toward the city, and peace between both sides. They were so close to agreeing that one faction had to wipe out the other, convinced Rigger's survival would spell doom for the Ash faction. A woman snapped at Alma's to remember one thing: some of the Diable faction weren't guilty at all. Alma's promised her he wouldn't slaughter everyone, but if he skipped every execution, that rebellion would only— and he swore he'd punish anyone who refused to fight for the kingdom during the war. But if a noble, or some unlucky relative, was forced to comply under political pressure or Alma swore he'd show mercy to the innocent, but if you dared to fight his army, he'd never forgive you. Almas revealed the shock. Half the testimonies meant to protect certain people. A real letter spelling out a rebellion plan was out there, but the authorities mostly brushed it off like it meant nothing. Almas swore his chosen plan would slash the death toll and keep the kingdom safe, no matter what it took. The next morning, right as dusk was settling in, Almi's arrival hit the air. While the armies swarmed, staring down a wall of soldiers, and his own allies, Alma's tightened his— Ron swept the area, then sealed Rigger's people inside their own houses. Alma's barked orders for the army to surge toward the mansion, locked in that fierce confidence that just as the troops surged forward, chaos erupted out of nowhere and slammed the defenders suddenly flung the gates wide open, and Alma's forces froze in total shock. Soldiers thrust white flags forward and surrendered Rigger. While Rigger erupted with fury, Rigger got shoved forward as a captive, while his own Gilbert closed in on Alma's, tossed aside any loyalty to Riggar, and swore he'd serve. Alma confirmed it was Gilbert, and pressed him on what he was up to, while Rigger screamed. Gilbert swore his loyalty to Rosi's king, then reminisced about old battles and the royal nods that Alma snapped out of nowhere and ordered Ron to arrest Gilbert, leaving him stuck. Ron drilled Gilbert with the brutal truth: countless crimes under Riggar, no matter how much he swore he was loyal to Alma's. Alma's told Gilbert to get up, but Gilbert kept snapping back over and over. Riggar pulled Alma's aside and admitted they'd crossed paths in the worst way, then insisted he never really hated him at all. Alma's sentence to execution came down hard, because their rival Rigger dropped into a low bow, begging for his life as Alma's let out a heavy sigh and weighed his plea. Riggar was this close to getting arrested and thrown in prison, pressed hard enough to— Yuria strode up to the trapped Rigger and ended the fight against the Debil faction for good. Abdamus urged Yuria to head back with him, but Tetra jumped in on the three of them teamed up to head home together, trading a hard-won sigh of relief now that the chaos was finally over. A sudden wave of laughter from the crowd cut through their escape, and Alma's and Yuria snapped her head toward the mocking voices and realized, through a magical— Alma snapped out a warning: danger was stalking them, and he told his companions to stay razor alert. Rigger was slammed out of nowhere. Blood exploded from his mouth and chaos exploded while Yuria fought to make sense of the wild, sudden events tearing through everything. The narrator brought in Seimei, an officer who wrote down every single moment of the 7-day war in stone-cold. Riggar got wiped out by a bizarre, deadly disease that made him bleed from every body opening. When he finally slipped back to Rossity Palace, he pushed through the crowd and boldly proclaimed that he'd take the throne. Even with the announcement ringing out, he insisted one thing: he hadn't officially become king yet because he wasn't married to Yuria. Tradition shut the door on his succession. No divine blessings, no purging rituals, no way in. While they kept preparing for the marriage and the ceremony, one heavy thought pressed down on everyone. Once this was over, real kingship would finally be taking the throne. While nobles crowded in for greetings, he juggled his duties and couldn't help wondering why Rosichi was grabbing all that attention. Just as he was about to crush the rising threats, he proved he belonged. Delegates rolled in and started handing Barrow's tasks on the spot. While everyone braced for even more royal guests, even with exhaustion eating at him, he still kept the guests coming, plotting how he'd catch up with the others the moment the ceremonies finally ended. King Exius and his queen swept in at once, flashing warm smiles and greeting the brand new seeing how valuable Olmos was. Exius heaped praise on their alliance and demanded they renew their bond after the war's support. Breaking news hit hard. Rossi, the massive northern kingdom, had dispatched a whole convoy. Even though the emissary's visit was casual, it basically cleared the way for them to step in and waste no more time. Mysterious woman swept into the royal hall. Her confident presence rattled Olmos to his core. Right after that, Olmos finally got called into the palace. For the marriage he'd waited forever for, Olmos and Yuria finally clapped eyes on each other again. And joy exploded on their faces. Clad in white, Yuria radiated pure beauty, and he almost blurted out praise on the spot. Hands clasped tight, they strode out side by side and faced the packed crowd inside the ceremonial hall. Wrapped in love and flanked by nobles, they were welcomed with open arms the moment the ceremony kicked off. Olmos stood at the altar beside Yuria, heart pounding, ready to seal their royal union. Tetra took her place as the officiator because of her high rank and because she knew him personally. With a heavy, solemn voice, she demanded they swear to stand by each other no matter what came next. The ceremony rolled forward as the sacred ring was lifted at last. They traded blessings like sparks in the air, calling on divine protection and praying for a long, unbroken life together as husband and wife. The ritual crashed to a close with an oath kiss, sealing their bond for good. Tears spilling, Yuria pulled her in tight, and they both swore they'd never let go, together forever. Their kiss sealed the wedding, and the crowd went wild with cheers beneath the palace's sacred hall. Even though Olmos and Yuria were officially married, they both knew they had one last obligation to finish before you nearly stopped everyone from watching as you nervously got ready for the big final public ceremony. The crowd stood in stunned silence as the priest struck flint and roared torches to life, readying everything. Masked performers reenacted the ancient king's beheading, turning it into a brutal reminder. Spectators stared in confusion. The masked figure swore a deadly symbol and watched the invaders. Because the performance was a brutal tribute to the first king's vengeful rise, he nearly swung in with a dramatic finishing strike. The ceremony wrapped up with Rossitsu almost dropping to his knees. He stood tall before the gods and the people, claiming the throne as the 20th. After the ceremony, he almost blurted thanks to his companions. Then finally, Yuria celebrated the victory, then almost blurted that their real duty. Suddenly, the hall detonated with chaos as a massive creature surged in from behind Alma. To everyone's shock, a dead deer came crashing into the middle aisle out of nowhere. Then, almost like fate teasing him, a griffin showed up in the open and offered him a deer as a coronation gift. A gigantic griffin swooped down into the city square, and the whole crowd erupted into chaos. As everyone leaned in, whispers flew the moment they verified Olmos's identity. Griffin's son, once mocked and doubted, now finally stepping into the light. Griffin grilled every human tradition, baffled by their relationships, yet he still honored Alma's as the key figure holding everything together. Right before he left, Griffin praised Alma's sharp decisiveness, and out of nowhere, Griffin snapped to whispers tore through the crowd, the moment they realized the mysterious woman had walked the earth more than 500 years ago. Turns out she was Melan, Rosal's prime minister and the mastermind who birthed voodoo magic. Even though she looks young, she once assassinated Ethel, the invading king who Griffin took the wine as a farewell gift, then fired off a final command. He took off, and right as his team finally recognized him as the old man of the... He almost blurted out doubts about his own role. But King Razate stepped in, invited him to talk. Over dinner, Almaz asked King Raizidi if he regretted the purge, and the whole room snapped into a tense, deadly silence. He almost confessed, then snapped back with it had to be done. Rosti pushed for total purges, swearing they wiped out every... Even with all their differences, he almost spilled his biggest dream, to end the war for good by uniting the whole King Razati nodded at Almaz's dream, and the truth hit him. His reign was ending, and just as Rosti almost got the words out, he clutched his chest, let out a strained gasp, and collapsed before he could finish. He screamed as Rosti crumpled into unconsciousness, and the whole crowd surged forward to lift their fallen king. Roasty later jolted awake in bed, and when she woke up in a sea of flowers, locked eyes with a mysterious figure across. Roasty caught a vision of his late wife, and she pushed him back, telling him to freshly revived. Yuria nearly brought it up, then winked and played it off, making it sound like she'd be ready to start having their child right away. He raised serious doubts about Rigger's death. Yuria snapped back that it happened because magical backlash tore him apart. Yuria unleashed her power and forced everyone to witness it for real, clear as day, but totally impossible to control. She told him her blessing was forged by fairies, but the real punch of it stayed a mystery. During the blessing, she suddenly remembered a mysterious voice, and her gut screamed that once everyone started recognizing the blessing, its weight crushed him harder. Then when Yuri almost obsessed over other hidden effects, but she admitted she couldn't detect it. He stared back on his war training, feeling the shift in his bones, and knew, deep down, that his qualification. He almost spilled the truth about his brutal war, purging and killing without a shred of remorse. And he couldn't stop wondering, did that blessing ignite these feelings, and was it secretly steering every choice he made? He even wondered if chasing more followers would supercharge the blessing. Yuria suddenly snapped awake to the truth. Once she understood even knowing the blessing was manipulating them, they still admitted they couldn't. Barely their blessings can twist your thoughts, and even an accidental wish can drag you straight into death. Against all predictions, Almost declared he'd protect Lai. He made sure Yuria knew this. Some of his own supporters didn't just. He held his ground with steel confidence, convinced his sight matched the exact path he figured the next move was picking loyal retainers who matched his. Almost pushed them to drop everything else and focus on crafting that heir, for now. Their bond surged to a whole new level, as confidence and trust carried the couple into their very first night together. Elsewhere, people realized the night had kicked off and respectfully kept their distance, refusing to intrude on their privacy. On the 5th day of the 7-day war, Allied cavalry slammed westward across the open plains, charging like a thunderclap. Thanks to an insectoid scout, their commanders stayed locked on with razor-accurate intel, as Dalmorger with their flying creatures. The Mealings hunted every enemy move. After Dalmorger fell in the north, the generals huddled and argued over whether to smash. Shaking with fear of civil war after Tyria's fall, Meline, wrapped in mystery, slipped into their minds. Because she was the one who raised the first king. After ripping himself away from the king, Mealing slipped out with quiet grace to chase his mystery. Soldiers leaned in, whispering in pure awe at Mealing, young-faced yet ancient, someone who had lived and served for centuries without age. She got to her door, hit the entrance switch, and whoosh, revealed a secret staircase straight down underground. Inside her enormous sanctuary, Mealing sank into place, ready to brew tea and dive back into solitaire. As she poured the tea, she told him she finally unveiled the fruit of decades of relentless work. Her body kept healing at breakneck speed, staying razor-sharp. Yet if someone ripped her apart completely, even with immortality in her grasp, Mealing finally confessed it. 500 years of brutal hardship had ground down her spirit. Fueled by purpose, she didn't chase Mealing stared at the idea of immortality, wondering, would it finally bring peace? Or unleash? She feared immortality would trap her in a never-ending nightmare. But she vowed she'd never. Her mission snapped into focus. Bring Ethel back from the dead and crawl home to their homeland, even if it destroys everything in her path. Mealing called out a familiar soul, Almas, and brushed him off like he was no danger at all. Even with the shared origins pulling at his curiosity, Mealing sneered. Kurosaki Mari sat there, calm as ice and sharp as a blade, sipping her tea in silence while elsewhere in the Raz's sectoratory, Almas kicked back and soaked in a secluded mountain hot spring. He soaked in the sulfuric steam, drinking in that wild natural view, and let the hot spring's calm swallow him up. Two girls slip into a nearby bath too, soaking up the warm water. They couldn't get enough of that spring's comfort, so they vowed to run back to it every chance they got. The group started swapping notes on local customs, and they pointed out that Adeline barely. Yuria pushed the idea of open, budget-friendly hot springs, while Almas froze, worried about. They reminded Almas that, as king, he could afford an occasional indulgence. Almas stared into the weight of that noble interference, afraid the land rewards would hand debels. While centralization crawled forward, they admitted the only way. Yuria leaned in and grilled Almas about his plan to unite Adelania, quoting her own father's words like a weapon. Almas remembered the old king's wish and laid it out plain. He kicked off his reform by slapping taxes on every stretch of land and slowly choking the nobles' grip on power. He argued that handing real power to the people would cancel out the nobles' grip. Deep down, he was convinced that if he spread coin and power, once prosperity and real power took hold, They knew everyone's political hunger would flare up now. Almost pushed coinage and democratic influence hard, betting that a slow shift in civic life would finally lock in long-term. Just when the air turned heavy, one girl cracked the tension. Alma nodded like, "Yeah, you've got a point," then pushed the real issue, choosing the next ruler fairly, no tricks, no bias. Tetra pushed for Urias's child to take the throne, swearing it would keep the kingdom united. After a long, intense talk, the three finally kicked back in the spring air. Resting almost got a letter from King Excess, and Barrows swooped in. The letter dropped a bombshell, an upcoming wedding in the Exes kingdom, and it almost, even though the purge worked, that lingering resentment ate away at his stability. So much that almost picked diplomacy over direct conflict, and now his main mission was clear. Forge stronger. He studied the map. Four kingdoms ringed retail like a trap. Ritsashi's climb started shaking the southern kingdoms, and Almos knew the danger was right in front of him. Burveld and the fact that nobody really knew Almos had neighboring kingdoms on it. Almos mapped out his very first diplomatic trip to Exa, making it crystal clear he'd back the alliance. And had a sharp, that visit wasn't just a trip, it was diplomacy back. Raymond hooked up with Almos as they pushed through the Alma range. Both of them walking in with mute. Almos finally gave Raymond what he asked for, straight, no games, and Ruz was ordered to keep a tight watch on you. She and Almos touched down in the Excess capital, where icy winds whipped through the air. Inside the castle walls, Almos tightened his resolve and vowed. No care. King Exaz and Mutsail were greeted almost like royalty, smooth, respectful, and full of intent. Because with Mutsail right there, trust came fast. King Excess threw his support behind profit-sharing terms, feeling a surge of opportunity. Prince Matel stepped forward and bowed to Alma, and then the royal family crowd started firing off introductions, one name at a time. Matel finally got the truth. His mom had recovered, thanks to Urea, and almost practically exhaled his... He couldn't shake the feeling that Prince Lados's curse was tied to something bigger. Maybe it was born from a bitter... Musio beamed and welcomed Almos with open joy, but Ladas froze in hesitation, clearly squirming at the fact that Musio was getting the first royal greeting. Ladus almost caught the way Mutsio kept glaring at him, and that silence hit harder than answers, because now he was sure Ladus was... Musio marched up and proudly introduced his bride, Raquilla, to Almos. Raquilla apologized for vanishing earlier, then admitted her health had kept her from... He almost blurted out a compliment about her beauty, and Tetra, standing right there, felt a jealous spark. Tetra snapped at him for his comment, and Mutsio wrapped up the introductions in a flash, ditched Almos, and slipped out with Almos finally got to speak to Prince Ladus, but the prince gave him a polite... Ladus shot off before anyone could stop him. Almos and The wedding's first day kicked off, and Mutsio greeted Almos with open warmth. A massive feast kicked off right after, and everyone, yeah, even him and Tetra, dug into juicy On the second day, Mutsio threw Ruzio a hard-earned thank you, and their old alliance still held. As the wedding finally kicked off in full, Raquilla slid in beside Musio while guests filled the hall, all of them holding... I almost figured it out too. The ceremony I saw wasn't the... He poured wine from Rizio into Musio's hands, blessing him, and Raquilla, with nothing but peace and endless prosperity. On the last day, Almos handed out heartfelt congratulations, and right then Urea broke down the ritual for him. This sacred sheep sacrifice meant to honor the gods of Exet. Mutsio and Raquilla sealed their vow in front of the whole tribe, and right there, the sacred wedding ceremony. Urea meant to check on the third consort, and nearly decided to stay one more day. The wedding finally wrapped up in calm peace, and just as he was about to slip out the door, diplomatic talks kicked off. Elmos and Raymond stepped in as negotiation partners, facing off against King Exaz and Prince Matel. The meeting sealed old promises for good. Almos and Exaz locked in a handshake that sent political trust rocketing between their kingdoms. King Almos and Raymond storm into the Exist tribe's capital, greeted like royalty by a local guide. The alliance meeting kicks off with barely any demands, everyone praying for smooth, peaceful diplomacy with no sparks of conflict. Introductions fly back and forth as Almos, Matel. After the last war, he still can't stop thanking the cavalry. So now he almost showers Exiz's warriors with praise for how relentless. He pitches wool and horses for the deal, and Ixis counters with rare beasts. Exist demands wheat, wine, and whatever leftovers they can get, then almost dares you to ask, okay, what else do... To everyone's shock, Ixis didn't just talk. He demanded iron tools and threw in wild, heavy-duty requests even. Ixis scours for iron to gear up for war and keep farms running. He was about to propose swapping out the tools and sending blacksmiths instead, trying to repay the old help while keeping the Exis nods in agreement, and both sides spring into action. The Axis leader throws out another question and demands all. Nidal holds up a pink, gem-like stone, stares at it like it's doing something sneaky. Then, once permission is granted, he can't help but dig in and examine it. Mythil almost clocks the rock salt, then snaps. That stuff's native to Exis because it's only just been done. He's taught how to export rock salt through Exis. Then when the prices dip, Raises' economy could take a hard hit. IXIS has zero mining tech, so their leader comes begging, pulling him in to help extract. Ixis pitches selling rock salt for dirt cheap, and he even starts toying with the idea of figuring out resale profit. Almost sounds like a maybe. Then Ixis lays it out. Hostile tribes are choking trade with the Curitians, and they need Raises' help. It bluntly admits their tribe can't trade for a damn thing, so they pin all their hopes on Raises to handle the foreign exchange without ever. Ixis wants only the bare essentials, wheat and wine, and nothing fancy that would shake up the economy. Saying yes to the deal basically locks him in, so they start a full-blown, no-wasting-time alliance talk right away. Inside the consort's chamber, a flash of magic runs a check, and the room is instantly cleared of any lingering curse. Now all eyes turn to Rachel's marriage, and everyone can't stop wondering. Yuria finally drops the bombshell. She and Mitsu share royal bloodlines, turning everything into a dangerous mix. Minal stitched together the family line, and the fear of something dead, even with a little unease still buzzing in the air, they confirm the consort's tense feelings can be. The women trade whispers about the second consort's icy indifference, and how she slips out of every fight by giving up her claim peace, even with a title that screams respected warrior. Her father chooses peace over politics, dodging every power struggle that could drag him into leadership. Forget bloodlines. He backed Prince Matil, betting succession is locked to old tradition. The firstborn takes the throne by custom, even though only Prince Lados, once gentle, now torments Matil and Mutsu, and his sudden change leaves everyone with a tense, silent worry and real fear. In his room, Lados gripped Rachel's photo like it was lifeline. His grief and jealousy, he remembers being crowned as the future king. But the truth is, all he ever wanted was Rachel. A mysterious woman suddenly steps into the room, and the moment Lados hears her voice, the cloaked woman leans in and promises Lados the throne, and Rachel, then twists his sorrow into a weapon, lighting his buried